Sometimes life hits you so hard that you wonder if you'll ever catch a break again. Cal Foster knew that feeling well as he watched his teenage daughter's college dreams slip away because he simply couldn't afford the tuition. Then his uncle died and left him an old airplane hangar with a rusted cargo plane inside. His family laughed and called it junk. But when Cal and his daughter started cleaning it out, they found a hidden room with treasures worth $134 million. His uncle had been secretly returning stolen war artifacts to families for decades. Now Cal faced an impossible choice between keeping the fortune or honoring his uncle's mission. What would you choose if sudden wealth came with the weight of history? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Pennsylvania sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt of the Johnstown Regional Airport as Cal Foster pulled his 15-year-old pickup truck through the rusted gates of what was now, apparently, his property. The keys felt foreign in his weathered hands that had spent 23 years maintaining aircraft engines, diagnosing problems that other mechanics couldn't solve, and keeping planes safely in the sky. Those same hands had been deemed redundant 3 months ago when the regional airline merged with a larger carrier and decided his experience wasn't worth his salary. Beside him in the passenger seat, 17-year-old Emma Foster stared out at the collection of weathered buildings with the kind of polite skepticism that only teenagers could master. Her dark hair, so much like her mother's, caught the light as she turned to study the largest structurally corrugated metal hangar that had seen better decades. "So this is what Uncle Henry left us," she said, her voice carrying that careful neutrality she'd perfected since her parents' divorce 2 years ago. "Mom thinks we should just sell it and put the money toward college." Cal shut off the engine and listened to it tick as it cooled. Sarah had made her opinion clear during their phone call last night. His ex-wife, now remarried to a successful insurance executive named Brad, had never understood why Cal couldn't just move on and find something more practical than aviation. She certainly didn't understand why he'd want to waste time exploring what she called Henry's junkyard. "Your mother sees dollar signs," Cal said carefully, "but sometimes things have value that can't be measured in bank deposits." Emma shot him a look that was part affection, part exasperation. "Dad, we need those dollar signs. My scholarship covers tuition, but room and board at Penn State is still $18,000 a year. And that's if I get the academic merit increase." The weight of that number settled between them like it had every day since Emma's acceptance letter arrived. Cal had been proud beyond words when she'd earned admission to the aerospace engineering program, proud and terrified. His unemployment benefits would run out in 6 weeks, and the few job interviews he'd managed had all ended the same way: overqualified for entry-level positions, too expensive for senior roles, and somehow both too old and too young, depending on who was doing the hiring. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the envelope that had arrived 3 days after Uncle Henry's funeral. Henry Foster had been his father's younger brother, the family eccentric who lived alone on 40 acres outside town and filled his conversations with theories about government conspiracies and corporate cover-ups. Most of the family had written him off as harmless but odder man who'd never married, never held a steady job, and spent his social security checks on what Sarah liked to call expensive paranoia. The letter inside the envelope was written in Henry's careful script. "Khalif, you're reading this. I'm gone, and you're probably wondering why I left you this place instead of something practical. Your father always said you were the only one in the family who understood that some things can't be fixed with money, only with patience and purpose. The hangar contains more than it appears. Look for the maintenance logbook in the cockpit. Everything starts there. Don't let them tell you it's worthless. Some treasures are hidden in plain sight. Your uncle, Henry." Emma had read the letter twice, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "Dad, that sounds a little crazy," Cal had finished. "Yeah, that's what everyone said about Henry. But he was also the man who taught me how to read aircraft schematics when I was 12. He might have been eccentric, but he wasn't stupid." Now, standing in front of the hangar, Cal felt the familiar mixture of hope and uncertainty that had defined the past few months. The building was larger than it had appeared from the road, probably big enough to house a small commercial aircraft. The sliding doors were secured with a heavy chain and padlock, but the key Henry had left fit perfectly. The doors opened with surprising ease, their tracks recently oiled despite the building's weathered appearance. Inside, shafts of sunlight illuminated what took Cal's breath away. A Douglas C-47 Skytrain, the civilian version of the military's legendary C-47 Dakota. The aircraft sat on the concrete floor like a sleeping giant, its aluminum skin dulled by decades, but its classic lines unmistakable. "Oh my God," Emma whispered, stepping closer. "It's actually a real airplane." Cal walked slowly around the aircraft, his trained eye cataloguing details. The plane was complete, both engines mounted, propellers in place, landing gear intact. Someone had covered it with tarps that were now draped across sawhorses nearby, suggesting regular maintenance. The registration numbers on the fuselage read N47HFF, Henry Foster's initials. "She's a beauty," Cal murmured, running his hand along the fuselage. C-47, probably built in the mid-1940s. These planes won the war-carried paratroopers on day, supplied the Berlin airlift, flew missions nobody talks about but everybody depended on. Emma had found a workbench along the hangar's wall, equipped with tools that looked both vintage and well-maintained. "Dad, look at this stuff." Uncle Henry wasn't just storing this plane, he was working on it. Cal joined her at the bench, examining the collection of specialized aviation tools, some of which he recognized as period-correct for 1940s aircraft maintenance. There were modern additions, 2 digital multimeters, updated torque wrenches, and what appeared to be recently purchased replacement parts still in their boxes. He was restoring her, Cal realized. This isn't some abandoned relic. Henry was bringing this bird back to life. The cockpit was accessible through a door on the port side of the fuselage. Cal climbed the short ladder, Emma close behind, and found himself in a space that transported him back in time. The instruments were all original analog gauges, toggle switches, and the kind of straightforward controls that made sense to a man who'd spent his career working with his hands. On the pilot's seat was a thick, leather-bound logbook. Cal opened it carefully, finding pages of meticulous entries in Henry's handwriting. But these weren't normal maintenance records. The entries were dated from 1945 to 1947, long before Henry would have owned the aircraft, and they detailed flights that made no sense for a cargo plane. Night flights to remote airstrips, coded references to passengers and cargo, and destinations across Europe that seemed random until Cal realized they all had one thing in common. They were routes that avoided major population centers and military installations. Emma leaned over his shoulder, reading the entries. "Dad, some of these flights were international. Look, this one says, Bergen to Glasgow, special cargo secured. And this one, Prague to Lisbon, manifest sealed. What kind of cargo operation was this?" Cal flipped through more pages, finding increasingly cryptic entries. References to cultural materials, family assets, and repatriation protocols. Near the back of the logbook, Henry had added his own notes in different ink, apparently trying to decode the original entries years later. "Emma," Cal said slowly, "I don't think this was a normal cargo operation. Look at these dates right after the war ended. And these destinations, they're all places where there were refugee populations, displaced persons, camps." Emma was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she said, "Uncle Henry wasn't just eccentric, was he? He was trying to figure something out, something about this plane's history." Cal closed the logbook and looked around the cockpit with new eyes. The plane was clean, organized, and clearly airworthy. Henry hadn't just been restoring it, he'd been preparing it for something. But what? Outside the aircraft, they found more evidence of Henry's work. A detailed wall chart showed the plane's systems, with recent updates and modifications marked in red ink. Another section of the hangar contained what appeared to be a research area filing cabinets, a computer that looked newer than anything Henry should have been able to afford, and boxes of documents labeled with dates and geographic locations. Emma opened one of the filing cabinets and whistled. "Dad, there are hundreds of files in here, all organized by country and time period. Look, Poland, 1,000. 945, 1,946. Czechoslovakia, 1,946, 1,947. Germany, 1,945, 1,948. What was Uncle Henry researching? Cal pulled out the Germany file and found photocopies of military records, newspaper clippings in multiple languages, and what appeared to be passenger manifests for refugee transport operations. Many of the names were highlighted, with handwritten notes in the margins, notes that referenced modern addresses and phone numbers. He was tracking people, Cal realized. Refugees, survivors, displaced persons. He was trying to find them or their families. Emma held up a photograph that had been tucked into one of the files. It showed a group of people standing beside the same C-47, but the photo was clearly from the 1940s, based on their clothing and the image quality. On the back, someone had written, "Final Mission Crew, Prague 1947. The work continues." Cal took the photograph, studying the faces. One of the men looked familiar, though it took him a moment to realize why. The jawline, the set of the shoulder sit, was a much younger version of Uncle Henry. "Emma," he said quietly, "I think Uncle Henry was part of something during the war, something he never told the family about." Emma had moved to another section of the hangar and called out, "Dad, you need to see this." She was standing beside what appeared to be a false wall section of the hangar's interior that didn't match the rest of the construction. When Cal joined her, she pointed to a seam in the metal that was almost invisible unless you were looking for it. "There's something behind here," she said. "I can feel air movement, like there's a space on the other side." Cal examined the seam more carefully and found a concealed latch mechanism. When he pressed it, a section of the wall swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a climate-controlled room that took his breath away. The space was filled with carefully organized storage containers, each labeled with codes that matched entries in the logbook. Against one wall stood a workbench equipped with what appeared to be art restoration, tool-specialized brushes, cleaning solutions, and magnifying equipment. But it was the contents of the open containers that made Cal's knees weak. Paintings, sculptures, jewelry, documents, and artifacts that even his untrained eye could recognize as valuable beyond measure. Each item was carefully wrapped and labeled with detailed documentation that included photographs, provenance research, and what appeared to be contact information for living relatives. Emma moved closer to one of the containers and gasped. "Dad, this jewelry, some of it still has names engraved on it. Look, this wedding ring says, Rebecca and Samuel, 1938, and this locket has photographs inside." Cal picked up a small canvas that was leaning against the workbench. Even unframed and in storage, he could tell it was a professional worker painting of a young woman reading a letter, executed with a skill that spoke of significant value. The documentation attached identified it as stolen from the Rosenstein family, Berlin, 1943, current family contact, Sarah Rosenstein Martinez, Miami, Florida. Uncle Henry wasn't just researching refugees, Cal said, his voice barely above a whisper. He was trying to return what was stolen from them. Emma was reading through more documentation, her expression shifting from amazement to something deeper. "Dad, some of these families, they're still alive, their children, their grandchildren. Uncle Henry has been tracking them down, maintaining contact. This isn't just a collection, it's a mission." Cal sank into a chair that Henry had apparently used for his research, overwhelmed by the scope of what they'd discovered. The maintenance logbook wasn't just about the planite, it was a record of an operation that had been running for decades, an operation to return stolen cultural treasures to their rightful owners or their descendants. Emma sat on a storage container across from him, holding a small prayer book that was clearly very old and very precious. "Dad, what are we supposed to do with all this? I mean, Uncle Henry left it to you, but this feels like it belongs to someone else." Cal looked around the hidden room, at the evidence of his uncle's lifelong dedication to a cause he'd never spoken about publicly. The letter Henry had left suddenly made perfect sense. Some treasures are hidden in plain sight. The real treasure wasn't the monetary value of the collection, it was the opportunity to complete the work Henry had started, to reunite families with pieces of their heritage they thought were lost forever. "I think," Cal said slowly, "Uncle Henry left us more than just an airplane and some old artifacts. I think he left us a purpose." Emma was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "So what's our first step?" Cal picked up the maintenance logbook again, this time reading it, not as a mechanical record, but as a mission log that spanned generations. "We learn everything we can about what Henry was doing. We figure out how this operation worked, who else was involved, and what still needs to be done." Emma smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in months. "You know what, Dad? I think Uncle Henry knew exactly what he was doing when he left this to you. Mom always said you were the one in the family who couldn't leave a problem unsolved." Cal felt something shift inside him, a sense of direction he hadn't experienced since losing his job. "Emma, this could take years. It might mean giving up the idea of selling everything for quick money. Your college expenses." Emma cut him off. "Dad, I've been thinking about that. Maybe there are other ways to pay for college. Scholarships, work, study programs, student loans. But this," she gestured around the room, "this is bigger than my tuition. This is about family. These families who lost everything and thought it was gone forever." Cal looked at his daughter with pride and a deep sense of recognition. She had inherited something from both sides of her family, his stubborn refusal to quit and her mother's practical intelligence. Together, they might actually be able to continue Henry's work. As they prepared to leave the hangar for the day, Cal took one last look at the C-47. In the afternoon light, it no longer looked like a relic from the past. It looked like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. "Tomorrow we start learning how to be treasure hunters," he told Emma as he locked the hangar doors. Emma grinned. "I can't wait to tell Mum we're keeping the airplane." Cal laughed, imaging Sarah's reaction. "Let's maybe ease her into that conversation." The following morning, Cal and Emma returned to the hangar with a sense of purpose that had been missing from Cal's life for months. They'd spent the previous evening researching Douglas C-47s and World War II refugee operations, finding fragments of information that suggested Henry's work was part of something much larger than a single man's obsession. Emma had printed out maps of post-war Europe, cross-referencing the flight destinations in Henry's logbook with known displaced persons camps and refugee centers. The patterns were becoming clearer. The mysterious flights had followed routes designed to move people and materials out of war-torn areas while avoiding official military channels. "Look at this," Emma said, spreading the maps across Henry's workbench in the hidden room. Every single destination was either a neutral country or somewhere with active refugee assistance programs. And the timing goal of these flights happened in the narrow window between the war's end and when the Soviets really locked down Eastern Europe. Cal was examining the artifacts more systematically, reading through Henry's meticulous documentation. Each item had been photographed, researched, and catalogued with a precision that spoke of decades of careful work. The jewelry alone represented dozens of families, their names and stories preserved alongside the physical objects that had once been their most precious possessions. It was Emma who found the item that would change everything. She was working through a container labeled Prague Collection 1947 when she lifted out a small wooden box that had been wrapped in what appeared to be original tissue paper from the 1940s. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a gold pocket watch that made both of them catch their breath. The watch itself was exquisite, clearly the work of a master craftsman, with intricate engravings covering both the case and the internal mechanism visible through a crystal back. But it was the inscription on the inside of the case that stopped Emma's heart. To my beloved Samuel Goldstein, on our wedding day, June 15, 1925, forever yours, Rebecca. Below the inscription, in different handwriting, someone had added, taken from Samuel Goldstein, Theresienstadt, December 1943, Officer, SS, Oberfuhrer Klaus Brenner. Cal took the watch from Emma's trembling hands, reading the inscription again as if the words might change. This belonged to a Holocaust victim. Someone documented exactly when and where it was stolen, and by whom. Emma was already reaching for Henry's research files, looking for any reference to the Goldstein family. What she found made the weight of their discovery even heavier. Henry had located Rebecca Goldstein Martinez, Samuel's daughter-in-law, living in Miami. Her husband, David Samuel's son, had survived the camps but died in 1987. Rebecca was now 83 years old, and according to Henry's notes, still talked about her father-in-law's pocket watch as one of the family treasures lost forever. "Dad," Emma said quietly. "Henry was in contact with her as recently as last year. Look, there are letters, phone records, even photographs she sent him of the family. She doesn't know he found the watch. She doesn't know he died." Cal felt the full weight of what Henry had been carrying settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about valuable objects, it was about family history, cultural heritage, and the deep wounds that genocide leaves across generations. Every item in this room represented someone's loss, someone's grief, and potentially someone's healing. They spent the next several hours systematically examining more artifacts, each discovery adding to their understanding of the scope of Henry's mission. A small painting that Henry's research identified as stolen from a synagogue in Vienna. A silver menorah taken from a family in Budapest. Jewelry, photographs, documents, and religious items that represented not just monetary value, but irreplaceable connections to family and faith. But it was the documentation that truly revealed Henry's character. For each item, he had compiled extensive research about its original owners, their fate during the war, and the current status of any surviving family members. Some families had been completely destroyed, parents, children, and extended relatives, all murdered in the camps. But others had survivors, descendants who had rebuilt their lives in new countries while carrying the memory of what was lost. Emma found a section of Henry's files that focused on the mechanics of restitution, the legal, ethical, and practical challenges of returning stolen cultural property. He had corresponded with museums, legal experts, and Holocaust education organizations, slowly building a network of people who could help facilitate returns when the time was right. He wasn't working alone, Emma realized, reading through correspondence with someone named Elena Vasquez at the International Commission on Holocaust-era Cultural Property. There are other people involved in this work, people who knew what Uncle Henry was doing. Cal found evidence of Henry's careful approach to each potential return. Rather than simply contacting families directly, he had worked with established organizations to verify identities, confirm provenance, and ensure that the return process wouldn't cause additional trauma for survivors or their families. Some of the documentation showed cases where families had declined to receive items back, preferring to leave the past buried. Henry had respected those decisions, maintaining the artifacts as part of a historical record rather than forcing unwanted reunions with painful memories. The emotional impact of handling these objects was overwhelming. Cal found himself thinking about his own father, about the stories that get passed down through families and the ones that get lost. His father had mentioned that Henry served in the war but never talked about specifics. Now Cal was beginning to understand why. Emma was examining a collection of photographs when she made another discovery that deepened the mystery. Mixed in with documentation from the 940s were recent photographs images of the same C-47 they'd been exploring, but taken at different locations. Some showed the plane at small airstrips Cal didn't recognize. Others showed Henry working with people Cal had never seen before, loading and unloading containers that looked very similar to the ones in the hidden room. "Dad, I don't think Uncle Henry's operation ended years ago. I think he was still actively working on this project. Look at these photos, some are dated just 6 months ago." Cal examined the photographs, recognizing Henry in his final months, but seeing him in an entirely new light. Instead of the eccentric recluse the family had thought him to be, these images showed a man engaged in purposeful, organized work, with a network of collaborators. The plane wasn't just being restored as a hobby, it was being maintained as an active tool for continuing the restitution mission. That realization led to another discovery. Hidden behind the artifact containers was a modern safe, its combination lock suggesting security measures that went far beyond protecting valuable objects. The combination was written in Henry's handwriting on a slip of paper tucked into the back of the maintenance logbook. The date of the Goldstein wedding, 6/15/25. Inside the safe, they found documents that revealed the true scope of what Henry had been doing. Financial records showed regular payments to and from organizations they were beginning to recognize: Holocaust research institutes, cultural property law firms, and private investigation services specializing in tracking looted art. There were also recent correspondence with people around the world, including several letters that made it clear Henry had been planning a major operation before his death. One letter, dated just 2 weeks before Henry died, was from Elena Vasquez. "Henry, the Munich collection has been located and verified. We have confirmed provenance for 127 items and located living relatives for 89 families. The German authorities are cooperative, but we need to move quickly before word gets out to private collectors. Can the plane be ready for transport by month's end?" Cal read the letter twice, then looked around the room with new understanding. "Emma, I don't think Henry died of natural causes." Emma looked up from another file she'd been reading. "What do you mean?" "Think about the timing. He's planning a major operation, working with international organizations, getting ready to transport a large collection of recovered artifacts. Then he suddenly dies of a heart attack, and conveniently leaves everything to the one family member who might actually continue his work." Emma was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. Then she said, "Dad, if you're right, that means there are people out there who didn't want Uncle Henry to succeed. People who had a lot to lose if he exposed how much stolen art is still in private collections." Cal felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the hangar, and now we've inherited not just his collection, but potentially his enemies. They spent the rest of the day photographing and cataloging everything they'd found, creating their own record of Henry's work. The pocket watch remained on the workbench between them, its gold surface catching the light like a reminder of the human cost of the history they were now part of. As they prepared to leave, Emma picked up the watch one more time. "Dad, what do we do with this? Do we contact Rebecca Martinez? Do we try to figure out what happened to Uncle Henry first?" Cal looked at his daughter, seeing the weight of responsibility settling on her young shoulders, just as it was settling on his own. The simple inheritance of an old airplane had become something much more complex, a mission that involved international law, historical justice, and potentially dangerous people who profited from keeping stolen treasures in private hands. "We start with what we know for certain," he said finally. "Tomorrow we contact Elena Vasquez and find out who else was working with Henry. We learn everything we can about how this operation functions and what kind of protection might be available for people doing this kind of work." Emma nodded, but Cal could see the questions in her eyes. The same questions he was asking himself. Were they in over their heads? Was the moral obligation to continue Henry's work worth the potential risk to their safety? And most importantly, what would happen to families like the Goldsteins if they decided it was too dangerous to continue? That night, as Cal lay awake thinking about everything they'd discovered, he kept coming back to the image of Samuel Goldstein's pocket watch. Somewhere in Miami, an 83-year-old woman carried the memory of her father-in-law's treasured timepiece, believing it was lost forever in the machinery of genocide. In a hangar in Pennsylvania, that same watch waited patiently for someone to complete the work of returning it to where it belonged. Cal realized that Henry hadn't just left him an inheritance, he'd left him a choice that would define the rest of his life. And increasingly, he understood that it wasn't really a choice at all. The next morning brought both answers and complications Cal hadn't anticipated. Elena Vasquez returned his call within an hour of his voicemail, her voice carrying the weight of genuine grief mixed with urgent concern. "Mr. Foster, I wondered when I would hear from Henry's family. I'm deeply sorry for your loss. Your uncle was one of the most dedicated people I've ever worked with." Her slight accent suggested Spanish origins, but her English was precise and professional. "However, I must scare you calling from a secure location. There are aspects of Henry's work that require certain precautions." Cal found himself looking around the hangar as if seeing it for the first time. "I'm at his property now, in the hangar with the airplane. Ms. Vasquez, I have to be honest. Until 2 days ago, I had no idea what my uncle was really doing. My family thought he was just an eccentric collector." Elena's laugh was dry and knowing. That was very much by design. Henry cultivated that reputation deliberately. It was excellent cover for moving high-value cultural artifacts across international borders. "Mr. Foster, how much do you know about the current state of Holocaust restitution efforts?" "Almost nothing," Cal admitted. "But I'm learning fast. My daughter and I found his collection yesterday, along with documentation that suggests this operation is much larger than just one man's project." "Your daughter?" Elena's tone sharpened with concern. "Mr. Foster, I need to be very clear about something. The people who profit from keeping stolen cultural property in private hands are not academic adversaries. They are criminals with substantial resources and few moral constraints. If you're planning to continue Henry's work, you need to understand the risks involved." Emma, who had been listening to the call on speakerphone, spoke up. "Miss Vasquez, what kind of risks are we talking about? And what exactly happened to our uncle?" There was a long pause before Elena answered. "Henry died of what appeared to be a heart attack, but the timing was suspicious. He was scheduled to meet with German authorities about a major recovery operation that would have exposed several prominent collectors who have been knowingly purchasing looted artifacts. The week before he died, someone broke into his apartment in town, though nothing appeared to be stolen." Cal felt the chill of confirmation. "You think he was murdered?" "I think he was under pressure from people who had a lot to lose if his Munich operation succeeded, and now that pressure may transfer to whoever inherits his work." Elena paused, then continued. "However, I also think Henry chose his heir very carefully. He spoke about you often, Mr. Foster. He said you were the one person in his family who understood that some problems require patient, methodical solutions." Emma looked at her father with new understanding. "Uncle Henry was recruiting you, wasn't he? Even before he died, he was planning for you to take over." Elena confirmed it. Henry had been planning his succession for months. He knew his health was declining, and he knew there were people watching his activities. He needed someone with technical skills, mechanical expertise, and the kind of stubborn integrity that wouldn't be bought off or scared away. Cal walked to the workbench, where Samuel Goldstein's pocket watch still sat, its gold surface reflecting the morning light streaming through the hangar windows. "Miss Vasquez, if we decide to continue this work, where do we start? And how do we know who we can trust?" "The first step is authentication and verification. Henry left you a substantial collection, but not all of it has been fully authenticated by external experts. We need to establish the provenance and value of what you have before we can begin planning returns." Elena's voice became more businesslike. "I can recommend a specialist who has worked with our organization before, Dr. Rebecca Klein at the Philadelphia Institute for Cultural Heritage Recovery. She's discreet, highly qualified, and has security protocols in place for exactly this kind of work." Emma was already taking notes. "What about the legal aspects? If these items were stolen, Are there laws about possessing them? Could we get in trouble just for having them? That's an excellent question, and the answer is complicated, Elena replied. Generally speaking, if you inherited the collection in good faith and are working actively to return items to their rightful owners, you're protected under most cultural property laws. However, there are people who would prefer to resolve these matters through private negotiation rather than legal channels. Cal understood immediately. You mean they'd rather pay us off or threaten us than risk having their involvement exposed in court? Precisely. Henry received several offers to purchase his entire collection, no questions asked, at prices well above market value. He turned them all down, but the offers became increasingly insistent in his final months. That afternoon, Dr. Rebecca Klein arrived at the hangar in a nondescript van, equipped with what appeared to be a mobile laboratory. She was a woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair, and the kind of focused intensity Cal associated with master craftsmen. Her credentials were impressive dual doctorates in art history and materials, science, 20 years of experience in cultural property recovery, and a reputation for meticulous work that had helped return millions of dollars worth of stolen artifacts to their rightful owners. "Before we begin," Dr. Klein said, setting up her equipment in the hidden room, "I need you both to understand what authentication really means in this context. We're not just determining whether these items are genuine, we're building legal cases that will stand up to challenges from people with substantial resources and expensive lawyers." She began with Samuel Goldstein's pocket watch, photographing it from multiple angles before examining it under high-powered magnification. Her equipment included spectrometers, UV lights, and databases that could compare materials and manufacturing techniques across historical periods. "This is extraordinary," she murmured, examining the watch's internal mechanism. "The craftsmanship is consistent with high-end Swiss manufacturing from the 1920s, and the engraving work shows tool marks that match techniques used by specific workshops in Berlin during that period." She looked up at Cal and Emma. "Your uncle's documentation is remarkably thorough. I can confirm that this watch was almost certainly made where and when your records indicate." Emma leaned closer to watch Dr. Klein work. "How can you be so specific about the workshop and time period? Every craftsman leaves signatures in their work tool marks, material choices, construction techniques that change over time and vary by region. It's like forensic science applied to cultural objects." Dr. Klein moved to examine a small painting that Henry had documented as stolen from Vienna in 1943. This piece, for example, shows brush techniques and pigment composition consistent with Austrian academic painting from the 1930s. But more importantly, it shows signs of having been removed from a frame. Hastily, you can see slight damage along the edges that suggests it was cut free rather than properly unframed. Cal watched Dr. Klein work, impressed by her systematic approach and the depth of information she could extract from careful examination. Dr. Klein, Elena Vasquez, mentioned that continuing this work involves certain risks. What's your experience with that aspect? Dr. Klein looked up from her examination, her expression serious. "Mr. Foster, in 20 years of doing this work, I've been threatened, sued, burglarized, and once physically attacked by someone who didn't want me to authenticate a particular painting. The trade in stolen cultural property generates billions of dollars annually, and some of the people involved will do anything to protect their investments." Emma's face paled slightly. "But you keep doing it anyway." "Because the alternative is allowing genocide to succeed permanently," Dr. Klein replied simply. "Every stolen artifact that remains in private hands is a victory for the people who thought they could erase entire cultures and families. When we return these items to their rightful owners, we're completing acts of resistance that began in the camps and ghettos 70 years ago." Her words hung in the air of the hangar, giving weight to the moral dimension of what Cal and Emma had inherited. This wasn't just about valuable objects, it was about justice, memory, and the responsibility that comes with knowledge. Dr. Klein spent the next several hours examining and documenting items from Henry's collection, building a preliminary assessment that confirmed what Cal had begun to suspect. They were looking at artifacts worth millions of dollars, with provenance documentation that would stand up in any court or museum authentication process. But it was her examination of a small, unframed canvas that provided the day's most shocking discovery. The painting appeared to be a simple sketcher study of hands holding a letter, executed in the loose, confident style that suggested the work of a master artist rather than a student or amateur. "My God," Dr. Klein whispered, examining the piece under UV light. "This appears to be a previously unknown Van Gogh study. Look at the brushwork, the way the paint is applied. This is consistent with his technique during the St. Paul de Moselle period." She looked up at Cal and Emma with something approaching awe. "If this authentication holds up under full analysis, you're looking at a work worth $30 to $40 million. Emma sat down heavily on one of Henry's storage containers. "Dad, how much money are we talking about for the entire collection?" Dr. Klein was making notes in her authentication log. "Based on what I've seen today, and assuming Henry's documentation proves accurate for the remaining items, you're looking at a collection valued somewhere between $80 and $150 million, possibly more, depending on how the market values items with this level of historical significance." Cal felt the weight of responsibility settle even more heavily on his shoulders. "Dr. Klein, what would happen if we decided this was too much for us to handle? If we turned everything over to museums or government agencies?" "That's certainly an option," she replied carefully. "But you should understand that institutional processes for cultural restitution can take decades. Many families don't have decades to wait. Your uncle's approach, working directly with families through established networks, often achieves results much faster." Emma was reading through more of Henry's correspondence files. "Dad, look at this letter from Rebecca Martinez, the woman whose father-in-law owned the pocket watch. She writes about how much it would mean to her grandchildren to have something tangible from their great-grandfather's life. She says they've grown up knowing they're descended from Holocaust survivors, but they have no physical connection to that history." Cal picked up the pocket watch again, feeling its weight not just in his palm, but in his conscience. Somewhere in Miami, an elderly woman and her family carried forward the memory of Samuel Goldstein without any of the physical anchors that help families maintain connection across generations. The watch represented not just monetary value, but continuity of identity that transcended even genocide. "Dr. Klein," he said finally, "if we decide to continue Henry's work, what would be our next steps?" She packed her equipment methodically before answering. "First, we complete full authentication of the entire collection that will take several weeks. Second, we verify current contact information for families and beneficiaries. Third, we develop security protocols to protect both the collection and yourselves. And fourth, we begin the process of returning items to families who are ready to receive them." Emma looked at her father with the kind of direct gaze that reminded him powerfully of her mother. "Dad, I know this is scary and complicated, but I keep thinking about that woman in Miami and all the other families who don't know their treasures have been found. How can we live with ourselves if we don't at least try?" Cal realized that the decision had already been made, probably from the moment they found Samuel Goldstein's watch. The question wasn't whether to continue Henry's work, it was whether they were strong enough and smart enough to do it safely. "Dr. Klein," he said, "let's proceed with the full authentication, and let's start putting together those security protocols. I have a feeling we're going to need them." 2 weeks later, Cal's life had been transformed in ways he couldn't have imagined. Dr. Klein's authentication work had confirmed the extraordinary value of Henry's collection, but more importantly, it had revealed the meticulous care with which Henry had built his documentation. Every item could be traced through a chain of evidence that connected its original owners to its theft during the war, and ultimately to its recovery through channels that spoke of decades of patient detective work. The Rosenberg family menorah had become the focal point of their first potential return. The seven-branched silver candlestick was a masterpiece of Jewish ceremonial art, crafted in Berlin in 1932 and stolen from the Rosenberg family home during Kristallnacht in 1938. Henry's research had located three surviving members of the family: David Rosenberg in Toronto, his sister Ruth Rosenberg, Chen in San Francisco, and their cousin Michael Rosenberg in London. Emma had taken the lead on family outreach, working with Elena Vasquez to establish contact through proper channels. The initial response from David Rosenberg had been skeptical. After 70 years, few Holocaust survivors or their families expected to see stolen treasures returned. But when Emma sent photographs of the menorah, along with documentation of its provenance, the response had been immediate and emotional. "My grandfather made that menorah himself," David had written in his email reply. "He was a silversmith, and it was his masterpiece, the last piece he completed before the Nazis destroyed his workshop. I thought I would never see it again, except in the photograph my mother carried with her when we came to Canada." The authentication process had also attracted unwanted attention. Cal had received his first business inquiry the previous Tuesday, a phone call from someone claiming to represent a private collector who was interested in purchasing any interesting aviation memorabilia Cal might have inherited. The caller had been vague about specifics, but had mentioned several items that weren't visible to casual observation, suggesting someone had detailed knowledge of Henry's collection. Emma had been researching the caller's phone number and had discovered it traced back to a shell company with connections to Marcus Rothstein, a New York art dealer whose name appeared in several of Elena's warnings about problematic collectors. Rothstein had a reputation for acquiring valuable artifacts through methods that avoided uncomfortable questions about provenance. "Dad, I think we're being watched," Emma said, showing Cal her research on her laptop. They were working in the hangar's main space, having established the hidden room as a secure area for the most sensitive artifacts. "Look at these satellite images I found online. There's a van parked on the access road 3 days in a row last week, always in a position where they could observe anyone coming or going from the hangar." Cal had noticed the increased attention as well. His neighbor Martha Brennan had mentioned seeing unfamiliar cars in the area, and twice he'd had the feeling of being followed when driving to town for supplies. The isolation that had once made Henry's property ideal for his work was now feeling more like vulnerability. Dr. Klein had recommended security measures that went beyond anything Cal had expected. The hangar now had motion sensors, security cameras, and a reinforced safe room where the most valuable items could be secured. More importantly, she had connected them with a network of people who understood the unique risks involved in cultural restitution work. "The thing you have to understand," Dr. Klein explained during one of her visits, "is that we're not just dealing with individual criminals. There's an entire ecosystem of dealers, collectors, auction houses, and even some museums that have profited from the trade in stolen cultural property. When you start returning high-value items to their rightful owners, you threaten that entire system." Emma had thrown herself into the research aspects of the project with an enthusiasm that reminded Cal of his own passion for understanding complex mechanical systems. She had become expert at using genealogical databases, Holocaust survivor registries, and international restitution networks to trace families and verify identities. Her work had confirmed current contact information for dozens of families and had uncovered several cases where Henry's documentation was incomplete. "Dad, look at what I found about the Prague collection," Emma said, spreading printed pages across the workbench. "Uncle Henry had been working on this for 15 years, but there are 12 families he wasn't able to locate. I think I've found current addresses for 7 of them, including one family that emigrated to Australia in 1949. Cal was learning to navigate the complex emotions that came with each potential return. Every artifact represented not just monetary value, but family history, cultural heritage, and often the difference between remembering and forgetting ancestors who had been murdered. The responsibility was both inspiring and overwhelming. The breakthrough in their first return came when David Rosenberg flew from Toronto to see the menorah in person. Cal and Emma met him at the Pittsburgh airport, a dignified man in his 70s, whose eyes filled with tears the moment he saw photographs of the candlestick on Emma's phone. "I was 5 years old when they came for it," he told them during the drive to the hangar. "My grandfather hid me in the cellar, but I could hear them upstairs, breaking things, taking everything of value. He died in Buchenwald, but my grandmother survived and made it to Canada with my mother. She talked about that menorah until the day she died, how it represented our family's faith and traditions going back generations." When David actually saw the menorah in the hangar's hidden room, his composure broke completely. He sat down beside the workbench where it was displayed and wept for his grandfather, for his family's losses, and for the miracle of having a piece of their history returned after 70 years. "How do I thank you for this?" he asked Cal and Emma. "How do I thank your uncle for carrying this burden all these years?" Emma knelt beside David's chair. "You thank him by making sure your grandchildren know the story. You thank him by keeping the traditions alive that the Nazis tried to destroy." The formal return ceremony took place the following week at the hangar, with Elena Vasquez present to document the process and ensure all legal requirements were met. Dr. Klein had prepared detailed provenance documentation that would allow David to donate the menorah to a museum if he chose, or simply to know with certainty that it was authentic and rightfully his. But the ceremony was disrupted by the arrival of Marcus Rothstein himself, accompanied by 2 men who looked more like security personnel than art experts. Rothstein was a well-dressed man in his 60s, with the kind of smooth manner that Cal associated with expensive salespeople. "Mr. Foster, I understand you've been busy with some interesting family heirlooms," Rothstein said, approaching the group with a confidence that suggested he was accustomed to getting his way. "I represent clients who are very interested in acquiring pieces with significant historical provenance. I'm prepared to make you an offer that would solve all your financial concerns." Emma stepped forward before Cal could respond. "Mr. Rothstein, these items aren't for sale. They're being returned to their rightful owners." Rothstein's smile didn't change, but his eyes hardened. "Miss Foster, I think you may not fully understand the complexities involved in cultural property law. There are legitimate collectors who purchased these items in good faith decades ago. Your uncle's activities, while well-intentioned, may have involved some legal irregularities." Elena Vasquez moved to stand beside Emma, her voice carrying the authority of professional expertise. "Mr. Rothstein, all of these items were stolen during wartime, which makes any subsequent sales legally invalid regardless of good faith. The families we're working with have clear legal standing to reclaim their property." Rothstein's composure slipped slightly. "Dr. Vasquez, I'm surprised to see you involved in what appears to be a family matter. Surely the International Commission has more pressing concerns than encouraging amateurs to interfere in complex restitution cases." David Rosenberg stood up slowly, still holding the menorah. "Mr. Rothstein, this candlestick belonged to my grandfather. It was stolen from our home during Kristallnacht. Are you suggesting I don't have the right to reclaim my family's property? I'm suggesting that after 70 years, ownership questions become complicated. There are legal processes, international agreements, procedures that should be followed." Rothstein gestured toward the hangar around them. This informal approach could create problems for everyone involved. Cal had been listening to the exchange with growing anger. "Mr. Rothstein, I think you should leave now. We're not interested in selling anything, and we're not interested in your legal advice." Rothstein's mask of politeness dropped completely. "Mr. Foster, you're playing with forces you don't understand. The people I represent have invested substantial resources in building their collections. They won't allow those investments to be undermined by amateur do-gooders." One of Rothstein's companions stepped forward slightly, a movement that made Cal's military-trained instincts kick in. But it was Emma who diffused the situation. "Mr. Rothstein," she said calmly, "I've been researching your background. I know about the lawsuits in New York, the investigations in Switzerland, and the questions about your acquisition methods. I also know about your family's own losses during the war. How can you profit from the same kind of theft that destroyed your grandparents' lives?" The question hit its target. Rothstein's face flushed, and for a moment his carefully controlled facade cracked. "You don't know anything about my family or my motivations, young lady. I know your grandfather was a rabbi in Vienna whose synagogue was destroyed in 1938, Emma continued. I know your family lost everything and barely escaped to America. And I know that somehow you've convinced yourself that profiting from other families' losses is justifiable because of what happened to your own family." Rothstein stared at Emma for a long moment, then turned to Cal. "Mr. Foster, your daughter is playing a dangerous game. I would encourage you to consider her safety when making decisions about how to proceed with your uncle's collection." The threat was unmistakable. Cal stepped between Rothstein and Emma, his voice deadly calm. "Mr. Rothstein, I think it's time for you to leave my property. Now." Rothstein and his companions left without further conversation, but their message had been delivered clearly. Continuing Henry's work would mean facing opposition from people with substantial resources and few scruples about methods. After they were gone, David Rosenberg approached Cal with new understanding of what the Foster family was risking. "I had no idea that returning my family's menorah would put you in danger. If you need to reconsider." Cal cut him off. "Mr. Rosenberg, that menorah belongs with your family. No threats from people like Rothstein are going to change that." Emma was already back at her laptop, researching everything she could find about Rothstein's business operations and associates. "Dad, if we're going to continue this work, we need to understand exactly who we're dealing with and how they operate." Elena Vasquez was making notes in her phone, coordinating with security contacts. "I'll arrange for additional protective measures. There are organizations that specialize in protecting people doing this kind of work." Dr. Klein was examining the hangar with new eyes, looking for vulnerabilities. "We may need to consider moving the collection to a more secure location." This facility was perfect for Henry's work when he was operating in secret, but you've now attracted attention from people who won't be deterred by locked doors. Cal looked around the hangar where his uncle had worked for decades, at the airplane that had carried stolen treasures back to their families, and at his daughter, who had thrown herself into continuing that work despite the risks. The confrontation with Rothstein had made the dangers real, but it had also clarified something important. They weren't just inheriting Henry's collection, they were inheriting his mission and his enemies. "We're not backing down," Cal said finally, "but we're going to be smart about how we proceed. Emma, I want you to compile everything you can find about Rothstein and his associates. Dr. Klein, help us understand what security measures are really necessary. Elena, connect us with whatever protection networks exist for people doing this work." Emma looked up from her laptop with a grim smile. "Dad, I think Uncle Henry knew this confrontation was coming. Look what I found in his files, detailed background research on Marcus Rothstein going back 5 years. He was preparing for exactly this kind of fight." Cal realized that Henry's inheritance had included more than artifacts and airplanes. It had included a war that was still being fought, with stakes that went far beyond money. And somehow, his eccentric uncle had determined that Cal and Emma were the right people to carry that fight forward. The question now was whether they were strong enough, smart enough, and determined enough to win it. 3 weeks after the confrontation with Rothstein, Cal's life had taken on the rhythm of a military operation. The hangar now operated under security protocols that would have seemed paranoid before he understood the stakes involved. Motion sensors monitored the perimeter, encrypted communications, protected their coordination with Elena's network, and Emma had become expert at counter-surveillance techniques that seemed far too sophisticated for a 17-year-old college applicant. The discovery of Captain Mueller's war diary had provided the breakthrough they needed to understand the systematic nature of the original thefts. The leather-bound journal, written in precise German script, documented the methodical looting of cultural treasures from Jewish families, museums, and synagogues across occupied Europe. What made the diary particularly valuable was Muller's meticulous record-keeping. He had catalogued not just what was stolen, but where it was taken, how it was transported, and who received it. Emma had been working with a German translator, recommended by Dr. Klein, slowly working through Mueller's entries from 1943 to 1945. The picture that emerged was of an organized operation that went far beyond the random looting portrayed in most historical accounts. Mueller had been part of a systematic effort to identify, catalogue, and redistribute cultural treasures to Nazi officials and sympathizers who could be trusted to keep them after the war. "Dad, look at this entry from December. 1943, Emma said, pointing to a translation she'd completed that morning. Mueller writes, "Completed acquisition of Goldstein collection from Theresienstadt, pocket watch and family silver, secured for Oberfuhrer Brenner's personal collection. Brenner pleased with quality and requests priority access to future acquisitions from similar sources." Cal studied the translation, feeling the personal connection to Samuel Goldstein's story deepen. So Mueller was essentially running a shopping service for Nazi officials who wanted to acquire specific types of stolen property. "It gets worse," Emma continued, flipping through more pages. "He documents the systematic destruction of records that would have allowed families to reclaim their property after the war. They weren't just stealing, they were trying to make the thefts permanent by erasing evidence of original ownership." Dr. Klein arrived that afternoon to examine Mueller's diary and immediately recognized its significance. "This is extraordinary documentation," she said, photographing each page under controlled lighting. "Military diaries like this are incredibly rare. Most were destroyed as the war ended. This provides evidence for systematic looting operations that historians have suspected but never been able to prove." Elena Vasquez joined them by video conference, her excitement evident even through the encrypted connection. Mueller's diary could be the key to recovering dozens of collections that have been lost for decades. If he documented the distribution network, we might be able to trace items that ended up in private collections across Europe and America. But the diary also confirmed their worst fears about the continuing criminal network. Several of Mueller's entries referenced post-war contingency plans and trusted collectors in neutral countries who would maintain the stolen collections until it was safe to begin selling them through legitimate channels. The implication was clear. The network that had profited from Nazi theft had survived the war and evolved into the modern black market for stolen cultural property. Emma had been tracking financial records that connected modern dealers to wartime networks, and the patterns were disturbing. "Dad, look at these transaction records I found in Uncle Henry's files. Some of the same families and business entities that received stolen art during the war are still active in the international art market today. They've been laundering stolen property for 70 years. Cal was learning to navigate the complex legal landscape that surrounded cultural restitution. Working with Elena's recommended attorneys, he'd discovered that many stolen items remained in private collections, not because their ownership was legitimately disputed, but because the legal processes for recovery were so expensive and time-consuming that families couldn't afford to pursue them. "The system is designed to favor current possessors over original owners," explained Sarah Chen, the cultural property lawyer Elena had recommended. "Even when ownership is clearly documented, families often face years of litigation against well-funded collectors who can afford to delay proceedings indefinitely." But their first successful return had demonstrated the power of working outside formal legal channels. David Rosenberg's menorah was now displayed in his home in Toronto, where his grandchildren were learning to light it for Shabbat dinners. The family had sent photographs of the ceremony, images that showed 3 generations gathered around the candlestick their great-grandfather had crafted with his own hands. Emma had framed one of those photographs and hung it in the hangar workshop. "This is why we're doing this," she would say when the stress of constant security precautions began to wear on them. "It's not about the money or the artifacts, it's about families getting pieces of their history back." The financial pressures hadn't disappeared, but they had taken on different dimensions. Cal had received 3 more offers to purchase the entire collection, each more generous than the last. The most recent offer, delivered through an intermediary who claimed to represent a private foundation interested in Holocaust education, had been for $60 million, with no questions asked about provenance or future disposition. Emma had researched the foundation and discovered it was another shell organization with connections to Rothstein's network. "They're trying to buy legitimacy," she told Cal. "If they can acquire Uncle Henry's collection through apparently legal means, they can claim they're supporting Holocaust education while actually removing items from potential restitution cases." The discovery of Henry's broader network had provided both resources and complications. Elena connected them with other inheritors, people who had taken over similar operations when the original operators died or retired. There was Maria Santos in Sao Paulo, who specialized in returning stolen religious artifacts to Latin American communities. James MacLeod in Edinburgh, who focused on art stolen from Scottish castles during various conflicts. Anna Kowalski in Warsaw, who worked to return items stolen from Polish Jewish communities. These connections provided expertise and mutual support, but they also revealed the scope of the opposition they faced. Each of the network members had stories of harassment, legal challenges, and even physical threats from people who profited from keeping stolen cultural property in private hands. "The thing you have to understand," Maria Santos told them during a secure video conference, "is that we're not just threatening individual collectors. We're challenging an entire economic system that has generated billions of dollars over decades. Some of these people will do anything to protect their investments." Cal had begun training Emma in basic security protocols that he'd learned during his military service, but he was increasingly concerned about involving her in work that carried such clear personal risks. Her college applications were due in 2 months, and he wanted her to have the option of walking away from the family's new mission if the dangers became too great. "Dad, we've had this conversation," Emma said when he brought up her safety concerns again. "I'm not walking away from this work, and I'm not going to college and pretending none of this matters. These families deserve to get their heritage back, and we're the people who can make that happen." Her commitment was both inspiring and terrifying. Cal watched his daughter handle death threats and surveillance with a maturity that made him proud and a determination that worried him. She had inherited something from both sides of her family: his stubborn refusal to quit when he believed in something, and her mother's analytical intelligence that allowed her to see patterns and connections others missed. The intelligence gathering had revealed disturbing information about Rothstein's operations. Emma had discovered that his art-dealing business was connected to a network of auction houses, private museums, and wealthy collectors who regularly purchased items with questionable provenance. More troubling, several of the people in his network had direct family connections to Nazi officials who had received stolen property during the war. "It's generational," Emma explained, showing Cal a family tree she'd constructed from public records and genealogical databases. The people who profited from Holocaust theft passed their collections down to their children and grandchildren, who have been selling pieces gradually through legitimate channels. They've been laundering stolen property for 3 generations. Dr. Klein had helped them understand the technical aspects of how stolen art gets integrated into legitimate markets. "The process is called surfacing," she explained. "Items that were stolen decades ago get gradually introduced into auction catalogs and gallery exhibitions, often with fabricated provenance documentation that makes them appear to have legitimate ownership history." The confrontation with Rothstein had escalated into a broader conflict with the network he represented. Cal had received legal threats, claiming that Henry's collection contained items that were legitimately acquired by previous owners, and demanding that all restitution activities cease pending resolution of ownership disputes. The lawsuits were clearly designed to create delays and financial pressure rather than to resolve legitimate ownership questions. "They're trying to outspend us and outlast us," Sarah Chen explained. Most families can't afford to fight these cases for years, so they eventually give up and let the current possessors keep the items. But Henry's network had resources that individual families lacked. Elena connected them with legal organizations that specialized in cultural property cases, donors who supported restitution efforts, and security firms that understood the unique risks involved in challenging criminal networks with international reach. The work was transforming both Cal and Emma in ways neither had expected. Cal found himself becoming expert in subjects he'd never imagined, studying international law, Holocaust history, art authentication techniques, and the complex psychology of survivors and their families. Emma had developed research skills that impressed professional investigators and a moral clarity that guided her through ethical dilemmas that would challenge much older people. Their relationship had deepened as they worked together on something that mattered more than either of their individual concerns. The financial pressures that had dominated their lives for months had been replaced by a shared sense of purpose that made other problems seem manageable by comparison. Martha Brennan, their elderly neighbor, had become an unexpected ally. She revealed that she had known about Henry's work for years and had occasionally helped him with research and communication. Her knowledge of local history and her connections to other families in the area provided resources that proved invaluable for their security and operational needs. "Your uncle was a good man doing important work," Martha told Cal during one of her visits to the hangar. "He knew there were risks, but he also knew that some things are worth the risk. Those families deserve to have their treasures back, and sometimes it takes people like you to make sure justice actually happens." The evening Emma completed her college applications, she and Cal sat in the hangar workshop, surrounded by documentation for dozens of families whose stolen treasures had been carefully preserved by Henry's decades of patient work. Emma had written her admission essay about the restitution project, explaining how inheriting her uncle's mission had changed her understanding of what it meant to choose a career that served something larger than personal success. "Dad," she said, looking around at the evidence of Henry's life work, "I know this is dangerous and complicated, but I can't imagine doing anything else. These families have been waiting 70 years for someone to care enough to bring their treasures home." Cal realized that his daughter had found her calling in the most unexpected way possible. The financial crisis that had threatened to derail her future had instead led her to work that would define her adult life. Henry's inheritance had included not just artifacts and airplanes, but a legacy that would continue through the next generation. The question now was whether they could survive the opposition long enough to complete the work Henry had started. The children's prayer book arrived on a cold November morning, delivered not by mail but by federal agents who had been investigating the theft of cultural property from European museums. Agent Sarah Mitchell from the FBI's art crime team sat across from Cal and Emma in the hangar's main workspace, explaining how a routine investigation had led them to Henry's collection. "We've been tracking stolen religious artifacts that have been appearing in American auction houses," Agent Mitchell explained, her professional manner softened by genuine respect for what Cal and Emma were attempting. "This prayer book was reported stolen from a synagogue in Prague in 1942, but it surfaced last month at a high-end auction in Manhattan. When we traced its provenance, we found documentation that led us here." The prayer book itself was heartbreaking in its innocence. Small enough to fit in a child's pocket, it contained Hebrew prayers and songs written in a careful script that suggested use by a religious school or family education program. But it was the handwritten notes in the margins that transformed it from a historical artifact into something profoundly personal: children's drawings, practice letters, and what appeared to be names and dates written by young hands learning to form Hebrew characters. Emma handled the book with extraordinary care, photographing each page while Agent Mitchell documented its condition and provenance. "Agent Mitchell, how did this end up in a Manhattan auction house? And how did the sellers think they could get away with selling something that was clearly stolen?" "That's the problem we face with cultural property crimes," Mitchell replied. "Items get passed through multiple hands over decades. And by the time they surface in legitimate markets, there are often several parties who claim they acquired them in good faith. The original theft might have happened 70 years ago, but the current sellers may genuinely believe they have legitimate ownership. Cal was reading through the FBI's documentation, which revealed disturbing patterns in how stolen religious artifacts moved through international markets. Agent Mitchell, it looks like this isn't an isolated case. How many items are we talking about? Thousands, possibly tens of thousands of religious and cultural artifacts that were stolen during the war and have been slowly surfacing in auction houses, galleries, and private collections ever since, Mitchell said. The challenge is that most of the people who could identify these items and verify their original ownership are no longer alive. Emma looked up from photographing the prayer book's margins. But the children who wrote these notes might still be alive. If they were 6 or 8 years old in 1942, they'd be in their 80s now. We might be able to find them. Agent Mitchell's expression suggested she'd had the same thought. That's why we're here, actually. The FBI's investigation has focused on tracking the criminal networks that profit from these sales. But we don't have the resources to trace items back to their original owners or surviving families. Your uncle's work provides a model for how that could be done. The prayer book had become the key to understanding a broader pattern of systematic theft that went beyond individual collectors. Henry's files contained documentation showing how religious artifacts had been specifically targeted during the war, not just for their monetary value, but as part of a deliberate effort to destroy Jewish cultural and religious life. Dr. Klein arrived that afternoon to examine the prayer book and immediately recognized its significance. This appears to be from a Jewish school in Prague's Jewish quarter, she said, examining the handwriting and paper composition under magnification. The Hebrew script and the children's notes suggest it was used for religious education, probably in a community school that served several synagogues. Emma had been researching Prague's Jewish quarter and the fate of its religious institutions during the war. Dad, I found records showing that there were 37 synagogues and religious schools in Prague before the war. Only 4 synagogues survived, and none of the religious schools. The Nazis systematically destroyed not just the buildings, but everything, inside books, artifacts, ceremonial objects. The personal nature of the children's notes made the prayer book particularly poignant. One margin contained what appeared to be a child's attempt to copy Hebrew letters, with corrections written in what might have been a teacher's hand. Another page had small drawings of stars of David and what looked like representations of Torah scrolls. Most heartbreaking were the names written in careful script: Rachel Stern, David Kohler, Miriam Weiss, and several others that were harder to decipher. These children were learning their religious traditions when the Nazis came for them. Cal said quietly, studying the innocent drawings and practice letters. This book represents not just cultural theft, but the destruction of an entire generation's religious education. Agent Mitchell was taking detailed photographs of the children's names and notes. Mr. Foster, would you be willing to work with us on identifying these children and any surviving family members? This case could provide evidence for broader investigations into networks that have been trafficking in stolen religious artifacts. Emma was already pulling up genealogical databases on her laptop. Agent Mitchell, I've gotten pretty good at tracing Holocaust survivors and their families. Give me a few days with these names, and I might be able to find current relatives. The FBI's involvement added both legitimacy and complexity to their work. Agent Mitchell explained that federal investigations moved slowly and required extensive documentation, but they also provided legal protection for people doing restitution work and resources for prosecuting criminals who trafficked in stolen cultural property. The challenge, Mitchell said, is that these criminal networks have been operating for decades and have sophisticated methods for avoiding prosecution. They use shell companies, international jurisdictions, and carefully constructed provenance documentation to make stolen items appear legitimate. Cal was beginning to understand that their confrontation with Rothstein represented only the visible surface of a much larger criminal enterprise. Agent Mitchell, are you saying that there are people who have built entire careers around selling stolen Holocaust artifacts? I'm saying there are people who have built fortunes around it, Mitchell replied grimly, and some of them have enough money and influence to make investigations very difficult. Your uncle appears to have been gathering evidence that could expose some very powerful people. The implications were sobering. Henry hadn't just been collecting stolen artifacts for eventual return to families. He had been building legal cases that could bring down criminal networks that had operated with impunity for generations. His death was beginning to look less like coincidence and more like the elimination of a serious threat to people with substantial resources and few scruples. Emma's research into the prayer book's origins had revealed connections to other items in Henry's collection. Dad, 3 of the families mentioned in Captain Mueller's diary had children who attended religious schools in Prague's Jewish quarter. The prayer book might have belonged to children from families whose other possessions are already in our collection. Dr. Klein was examining the prayer book's binding and paper composition when she made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden between the book's back cover and binding was a small piece of paper that had been carefully concealed for decades. When she extracted it using conservation techniques, they found a list of names and addresses written in the same careful script that appeared in the prayer book's margins. This appears to be a class roster, Dr. Klein said, examining the hidden document under magnification. Someone, probably a teacher or parent, hid this list inside the prayer book, possibly hoping it would preserve the names of children who might not survive the war. Emma counted the names on the hidden list. 23 children, with their addresses and what looks like their parents' names. Dad, this is like finding a time capsule from right before the Holocaust destroyed Prague's Jewish community. Agent Mitchell understood the significance immediately. This list could help us identify the families of origin for dozens of items that have appeared in illegal markets. More importantly, it provides evidence of systematic theft from specific communities that we can use in prosecuting current trafficking cases. Cal felt the weight of responsibility settling even more heavily on his shoulders. The prayer book represented not just another artifact to be returned, but evidence in federal criminal cases that could expose networks of people who had profited from genocide for 3 generations. Emma had begun cross-referencing the names on the hidden list with Holocaust survivor databases, and her preliminary results were both encouraging and heartbreaking. I've found records for 11 of these families in various survivor registries. 7 had members who survived the war and emigrated to other countries. But Dad, 12 families have no survivor records at all, entire families that were completely destroyed. The research process was emotionally exhausting. Each name on the list represented not just a potential restitution case, but a family that had been targeted for destruction, specifically because of their religious and cultural identity. The children who had written their names in the prayer book's margins had been learning traditions that the Nazis were simultaneously working to erase forever. Dr. Klein had been consulting with experts at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum about the prayer book's historical significance. This may be one of the most important individual artifacts we've encountered, she told Cal and Emma. It provides direct evidence of the systematic targeting of religious education and the deliberate destruction of Jewish cultural transmission. But the prayer book also represented danger for anyone working to expose the networks that had profited from such theft. Agent Mitchell was frank about the risks involved in pursuing federal cases against well-established criminal enterprises. Mr. Foster, I need you to understand that some of the people we're investigating have connections to legitimate businesses, political figures, and even law enforcement. When you start threatening their operations, they may respond in ways that go beyond legal intimidation. Emma looked up from her genealogical research with the kind of determined expression that Cal had learned to recognize as non-negotiable. Agent Mitchell, are you saying we should stop our work because it might be dangerous? I'm saying you should be aware of the risks and take appropriate precautions, Mitchell replied. But I'm also saying that what you're doing is important enough to justify those risks. These families deserve justice, and the criminals who have profited from their suffering deserve prosecution. That evening, Cal and Emma sat in the hangar workshop, surrounded by evidence of Henry's life work and the federal investigation that had grown out of it. The children's prayer book lay open on the workbench between them, its innocent drawings and practice letters serving as a reminder of what they were really fighting for. "Dad," Emma said quietly, "I've been thinking about those children who wrote in this book. They were my age, maybe younger. They were learning about their faith and their culture, probably excited about becoming adults and starting families of their own. The Nazis didn't just kill them, they tried to erase every trace that they had ever existed." Cal touched one of the small drawings in the prayer book's Margina child's attempt to draw a menorah that looked remarkably similar to the one they had returned to David Rosenberg's family. "Emma, every time we return one of these items to a family, we're proving that the Nazis failed. We're proving that Jewish culture survived, that families remember, and that some things can't be destroyed, no matter how much evil is focused on them." Emma was reading through more names on the hidden class roster, each one representing a child whose life had been cut short, but whose memory was preserved in careful script on aging paper. "Dad, I want to find every surviving family member from this list. I want them to know that their relatives' names were preserved, that someone cared enough to hide this record and keep it safe for 70 years. Cal realized that the prayer book had become more than just another artifact in their collection. It had become a mission statement for their work. The children who had written their names in its margins deserved to be remembered, and their surviving relatives deserved to know that pieces of their family's religious heritage had been preserved and could be returned. The federal investigation would provide resources and legal protection, but it would also increase the dangers they faced from people who had built fortunes on the systematic theft and trafficking of cultural property. Agent Mitchell's warnings about the sophistication and ruthlessness of these criminal networks were not exaggerations. But as Cal looked at his daughter, bent over genealogical databases and survivor registries in her determination to trace every name on the hidden list, he knew that they had moved beyond the point where personal safety could be the primary consideration. They had inherited not just Henry's collection, but his commitment to completing the work that the war had interrupted. The children's prayer book would guide them toward the most dangerous phase of their mission known, that would require them to confront not just individual criminals, but an entire system that had profited from genocide and had every intention of protecting those profits regardless of the cost. The truth about Henry's death came to light through a document that neither Cal nor Emma had been looking for, a coded ledger hidden behind the false bottom of a filing cabinet that Emma discovered while reorganizing Henry's research materials. The ledger appeared to be written in some kind of cipher, with entries that combined numbers, letters, and symbols in patterns that suggested systematic record-keeping rather than random notes. Emma had been developing a talent for pattern recognition that impressed even Agent Mitchell, and she approached Henry's cipher like a puzzle that could be solved through careful analysis. After 3 days of work, cross-referencing the coded entries with dates and locations from Henry's other documents, she began to see the structure underlying the cipher. "Dad, I think Uncle Henry was documenting something he couldn't risk writing in plain text," Emma said, showing Cal her preliminary decoding work. "Look at these entries from the past 2 years. They correspond to dates when he met with people, but the names are all in code. And these number sequences match up with financial transactions that aren't documented anywhere else in his files." Cal studied Emma's decoding charts, recognizing the methodical approach that had characterized all of Henry's work. "Emma, what kind of information would Henry need to keep in code? What was he doing that required this level of secrecy?" The answer became clear as Emma worked through more entries. Henry hadn't just been collecting and returning stolen artifact. She had been documenting the modern networks that continued to traffic in stolen cultural property, building legal cases that could expose criminal enterprises with international reach and generational continuity. "Dad, look at this entry from last February," Emma said, pointing to a decoded passage. Henry writes, confirmed connection between Rothstein organization and Brenner estate sale. Original theft documentation matches current auction catalog. Legal evidence sufficient for federal prosecution. Must coordinate with EV and network before exposure. Cal felt a chill of understanding. Evelena Vasquez. Henry was building a case against Rothstein that involved other people in their network. He wasn't just trying to return individual item. She was trying to bring down the entire criminal operation. Emma continued decoding, and each entry revealed more of Henry's investigation into networks that had been operating since the end of World War II. The cipher documented meetings with federal agents, coordination with international law enforcement, and detailed evidence gathering that had taken years to complete. But it was an entry from 3 weeks before Henry's death that made Emma's blood run cold. Brenner family estate sale scheduled for December. Rothstein organization planning to acquire entire collection through shell bidders. Federal raid coordinated for day after auction. Personal security compromised. They know about operation. Emergency protocols activated. If something happens to me, ledger contains evidence for prosecution. Cal and Emma must be protected. Cal read the entry twice, then looked around the hangar with new understanding of why Henry had been so careful about security measures. Emma, he knew they were going to kill him. He knew, and he still went ahead with the plan to expose them. Emma was decoding more recent entries, her hands shaking as the full scope of what Henry had discovered became clear. Dad, it's not just Rothstein. Henry documented connections to auction houses in New York, London, and Geneva. Private collectors in 7 countries. Art dealers who have been laundering stolen property for 3 generations. This isn't just about individual criminals, it's about an entire industry built on Holocaust theft. The coded ledger revealed that Henry had been working with federal agents for more than 2 years, slowly building legal cases that could prosecute not just current trafficking, but expose the historical networks that had allowed stolen cultural property to be integrated into legitimate markets. The scope of the investigation went far beyond anything Cal had imagined. But the ledger also revealed why Henry had been murdered. The criminal networks he was investigating had billions of dollars at stake and connections to legitimate businesses, political figures, and even law enforcement agencies in multiple countries. Henry's evidence threatened not just individual criminals, but an entire economic system that had generated enormous wealth over decades. Emma found Henry's final entries, written in the days before his death. Federal operation confirmed for December 15. Rothstein organization unaware of extent of evidence. Personal danger. Increasing surveillance confirmed. Apartment searched twice. If operation succeeds, network will be destroyed. If I don't survive, Cal has everything needed to complete mission. Emma has skills for genealogical research. Together, they can continue work. Cal sat down heavily, overwhelmed by the realization that Henry's inheritance had included not just artifacts and responsibilities, but membership in an ongoing war against criminal networks with international reach and generational depth. Emma, your uncle didn't just deeze. He was murdered to prevent him from exposing people who have been profiting from Holocaust theft for 70 years. Emma was reading through more coded entries, tears streaming down her face as she understood the full weight of what Henry had carried alone. Dad, he protected us by not telling us what he was really doing. If we had known about the federal investigation, we would have been targets from the beginning. But the ledger also contained information that gave them hope. Henry had documented the locations of additional collections, the identities of other people working on similar restitution efforts, and evidence that could help federal agents prosecute criminals who had operated with impunity for decades. Most importantly, the ledger revealed that Henry's network was still active. Elena Vasquez wasn't just a cultural property expert. She was coordinating international law enforcement efforts to expose trafficking networks across multiple countries. The people Cal and Emma had been working with were part of an operation that involved FBI agents, international prosecutors, and law enforcement agencies across Europe and North America. Agent Mitchell arrived at the hangar within hours of Cal's phone call, accompanied by 2 other federal agents and a prosecutor from the Department of Justice's Criminal Division. Mitchell's expression was grim as she examined Henry's decoded ledger. "Mr. Foster, your uncle was working undercover for us for more than 2 years," Mitchell said. "His death wasn't just murder, it was the elimination of our primary source of intelligence about criminal networks that we've been trying to penetrate for decades." Emma looked up from the ledger with new understanding of the danger they faced. "Agent Mitchell, does that mean we're now targets? Do these people know we have Uncle Henry's evidence?" "We have to assume they do," Mitchell replied. "Your uncle's security was compromised in his final weeks, and his killers may have learned about his succession plans before eliminating him. You're not just inheriting his collection, you're inheriting his role in an ongoing federal investigation." The prosecutor, a serious woman named Janet Cooper, explained the legal implications of what Henry had been doing. "Your uncle's evidence can support prosecutions under the National Stolen Property Act, international cultural property treaties, and RICO statutes for organized criminal enterprises. We're talking about cases that could result in decades of prison time for people who have never faced consequences for their crimes." Cal felt the full weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "Agent Cooper, what exactly are you asking us to do? Continue Henry's undercover work, put ourselves at risk to gather more evidence?" "We're asking you to continue what you're already doing," Cooper replied. "Return artifacts to families, document the criminal networks that oppose your work, and provide evidence for prosecutions that could break up trafficking operations that have been active since the war ended." Emma was studying the agents' faces, reading implications that hadn't been stated directly. "You're asking us to be bait, aren't you? You want the criminals to come after us so you can catch them in the act." Mitchell's expression confirmed Emma's assessment. "We're asking you to continue Henry's work under federal protection. Your restitution activities will draw out the criminals and will be there to document their attempts to stop you." The plan was both more complex and more dangerous than anything Cal had imagined. Henry's coded ledger revealed that the federal investigation involved multiple agencies, international cooperation, and coordination with prosecutors in several countries. The criminals they were targeting weren't just art dealers. They were part of organized crime networks with connections to money laundering, international fraud, and even terrorism financing. Emma was reading through Henry's documentation of the broader criminal enterprise. "Dad, these people aren't just selling stolen Holocaust artifacts. They're running international networks that traffic in stolen cultural property from conflicts around the world. African artifacts looted during civil wars, Middle Eastern antiquities stolen from museums, Asian art taken during various invasions. Holocaust theft was just the beginning." Cal realized that Henry's mission had been even more ambitious than returning individual items to families. He had been working to expose and destroy criminal networks that profited from cultural genocide across multiple continents and historical periods. Agent Mitchell was explaining the protective measures that would be put in place if Cal and Emma agreed to continue Henry's work. "We can provide physical security, electronic surveillance, and legal support. But we can't eliminate the risks entirely. These people have killed before, and they'll kill again to protect their operations." Emma looked at her father with the kind of determined expression that reminded him powerfully of her mother's stubborn integrity. "Dad, we can't walk away from this. Uncle Henry died to expose these criminals, and there are hundreds of families who deserve to get their treasures back. If we quit now, his death meant nothing." Cal knew his daughter was right, but the father in him wanted to protect her from dangers that could destroy both their lives. "Emma, this isn't just about returning artifacts anymore. We're talking about taking on international criminal networks that have killed people to protect their profits. And we're talking about justice for families who have been waiting 70 years for someone to care enough to bring their treasures home." Emma replied, "Dad, those children who wrote in the prayer book they died believing their culture would be destroyed forever. Every time we return an artifact to a family, we prove they were wrong. Agent Mitchell was watching the family discussion with professional interest and personal respect. Mr. Foster, I need you to understand that this decision will affect the rest of your lives. If you agree to continue Henry's work, you'll always be targets for people who profit from cultural theft. But you'll also be completing one of the most important justice missions in modern history. Cal looked around the hangar where Henry had worked for decades, at the airplane that had carried stolen treasures back to their families, and at his daughter, who had found her life's calling in continuing that work, despite the dangers involved. Henry's coded ledger lay open on the workbench between them, its decoded entries revealing the full scope of both the criminal networks they faced and the justice mission they had inherited. The simple inheritance of an old airplane had become something much more profound, a chance to complete the work that Holocaust victims had begun when they tried to preserve their cultural treasures for future generations. "Agent Mitchell," Cal said finally, "what do we need to do to finish what my uncle started?" The master list changed everything. Hidden in the deepest section of Henry's coded ledger, Emma discovered what amounted to a comprehensive catalogue of every stolen artifact Henry had tracked during his decades of investigation. The list contained not just the items in their collection, but thousands of pieces scattered across private collections, auction houses, and museums around the world, a roadmap to cultural treasures that families had assumed were lost forever. "Dad, this isn't just a list," Emma said, her voice filled with awe as she worked through Henry's final coded entries. "It's a complete inventory of cultural genocide." Uncle Henry spent 30 years documenting every piece of stolen Jewish heritage he could find, along with current locations, ownership chains, and legal strategies for recovery. The master list contained 847 individual items, ranging from religious artifacts worth thousands of dollars to paintings and sculptures valued in the tens of millions. Each entry included detailed provenance research, current ownership information, and documentation that could support legal restitution claims. Most remarkably, Henry had identified living descendants for more than 60% of the original owners. Agent Mitchell studied the decoded list with the kind of focused intensity that told Cal this discovery exceeded even federal expectations. "Mr. Foster, this document represents the most comprehensive catalogue of stolen Holocaust artifacts ever compiled. Your uncle's work could support restitution cases for the next 50 years. But the master list also revealed why Henry had been killed. His research had exposed the systematic nature of how stolen cultural property had been integrated into legitimate markets, implicating not just individual dealers, but entire institutions that had knowingly profited from Holocaust theft. Emma was cross-referencing entries with current auction catalogues and museum collections, her genealogical research skills now applied to tracking stolen treasures through decades of carefully laundered sales. "Dad, look at this pattern. The same items appear in estate sales, auction houses, and private collections in cycles of about 15 to 20 years. They're being moved regularly to make ownership histories harder to trace." Dr. Klein arrived that morning with news that accelerated their timeline dramatically. "Cal, Emma, we have a problem. 3 items from Henry's collection have appeared in auction catalogues for next week's sales in New York. Someone has detailed knowledge of what you have, and they're trying to muddy the legal waters by putting similar pieces on the market." Cal examined the auction listings Dr. Klein had brought. The items weren't identical to pieces in their collection, but they were similar enough to create confusion about provenance and ownership. They're trying to make it look like there are multiple versions of the same artifacts, so families can't be certain which pieces are actually theirs. Agent Cooper, the federal prosecutor, joined them via secure video conference with urgent news. "We've intercepted communications indicating that Rothstein's organization is planning a major operation next week. They know about the master list, and they're trying to acquire as many items as possible before families can file restitution claims." Emma was working frantically to decode more of Henry's entries, looking for information about specific threats and protective measures. What she found made her stomach drop. Dad, Uncle Henry knew this was coming. His final entries describe something called Operation Heritage, a coordinated effort by criminal networks to acquire hundreds of stolen artifacts before federal investigations could expose them. The timeline Henry had documented was terrifying in its precision. Rothstein's network had planned to eliminate Henry, acquire his collection through legal challenges or theft, and then systematically purchase similar items from other sources to create a monopoly on Holocaust artifacts that would make restitution cases impossible to pursue. They're not just trying to profit from individual sales, Agent Mitchell explained. They're trying to corner the entire market in stolen Jewish cultural property so they can control which families get their heritage back and which items disappear into private collections forever. Cal felt rage building as he understood the full scope of what they were fighting. These people aren't just criminals, they're continuing the work the Nazis started. They're trying to complete the destruction of Jewish cultural heritage that began during the Holocaust. Elena Vasquez joined their emergency planning session from her office in Geneva, coordinating with law enforcement agencies across 3 continents. The operation Rothstein is planning involves auction houses in New York, London, and Geneva simultaneously. If it succeeds, they'll acquire enough stolen items to make future restitution efforts nearly impossible. Emma was reading through Henry's strategic planning notes, finding detailed preparations for exactly this scenario. Dad, Uncle Henry wasn't just collecting evidence, he was planning a counter-operation. He has detailed plans for exposing the entire network at once, using the master list as evidence in coordinated prosecutions. The plan Henry had developed was audacious in its scope. Rather than pursuing individual restitution cases, he had been preparing to expose the entire criminal network through simultaneous legal actions in multiple countries, supported by comprehensive evidence that would make denial impossible. Your uncle understood that half measures wouldn't work, Dr. Klein explained. These criminal networks have survived for 70 years because they've never faced coordinated opposition. Henry's plan was to hit them everywhere at once, with evidence so overwhelming that their political and financial connections couldn't protect them. Agent Mitchell was coordinating with her international counterparts, but the challenges were enormous. We're talking about arresting people with connections to legitimate businesses, political figures, and even law enforcement agencies in multiple countries. The coordination alone requires months of preparation, and we have less than a week. Emma looked up from Henry's strategic notes with sudden understanding. We don't need months of preparation. Uncle Henry already did it. Look at these entries from the past 2 years. He's been coordinating with law enforcement agencies, cultural property experts, and restitution organizations across 6 countries. The network is already in place. Cal read through Henry's coordination notes, seeing evidence of planning that rivaled military operations in its complexity and precision. His uncle had spent years building relationships with people who could support simultaneous legal actions against criminal networks on 3 continents. The question, Agent Cooper said during their secure conference, is whether we can activate Henry's network fast enough to prevent Rothstein's operation from succeeding. If they acquire the items they're targeting next week, it could take decades to recover them through legal channels. Emma was examining Henry's final entries, looking for specific tactical guidance. What she found was both inspiring and terrifying. Dad, Uncle Henry knew he wouldn't survive to see his plan completed. His final entry says, "If Cal and Emma are reading this, the time for careful preparation has ended. The network is ready. The evidence is complete. Now we finish what the victims started when they tried to preserve their treasures for future generations." The weight of that responsibility settled on Cal's shoulders like a physical burden. Henry hadn't just left them artifacts, and evidently had left them a mission that required them to risk everything to complete work that transcended individual family needs. Dr. Klein was examining the master list with new understanding of its strategic importance. This catalogue isn't just research, it's a weapon. If families know their treasures have been located and can be recovered, They'll demand action from governments and law enforcement agencies. The criminals' greatest advantage has always been families not knowing their items survived the war. Agent Mitchell was coordinating tactical plans with federal agents in New York, where Rothstein's auction house operation was scheduled to begin. We can't stop the auctions without revealing our investigation, but we can document everything and build cases for recovery afterward. The question is whether families will be able to afford decades of litigation against well-funded criminals. Emma was working through genealogical databases, using Henry's master list to identify current family members who could file restitution claims for items that would appear in next week's auctions. Dad, I've found living relatives for 37 of the items that Rothstein is planning to sell. If we can contact them before the auctions, they can file legal claims that would complicate any sales. Cal realized that Emma had identified their role in Henry's final operation. They weren't just inheriting his collection, they were becoming the communication link between stolen treasures and families who thought those treasures were lost forever. Emma, how quickly can you contact these families? And how do we explain that their great-grandmother's candlesticks or their grandfather's prayer books have been found after 70 years? Emma was already composing emails and making international phone calls, her research skills now applied to the urgent work of connecting families with their stolen heritage. Dad, most of these families have been hoping for this call their entire lives. Holocaust survivors and their children never really give up hoping that something might have survived. The responses began coming within hours. Families in Toronto, Miami, Los Angeles, and Tel Aviv, who had grown up with stories of treasures lost during the war, suddenly learned that those items had been preserved and could potentially be recovered. The emotional impact was overwhelming joy, grief, hope, and determination combined in ways that reminded Cal why Henry's work had been worth dying for. But the criminal networks weren't passive. Agent Mitchell reported increased surveillance around the hangar, and Emma discovered that their phone calls and emails were being monitored. They know we're contacting families, Mitchell warned. They're going to try to stop the restitution claims before families can file legal paperwork. Cal was learning to think tactically about their mission, drawing on military training he hadn't used in decades. Agent Mitchell, what kind of protection can you provide for families who are filing restitution claims? If these criminals killed my uncle, they won't hesitate to threaten families who try to recover their property. The federal response was both reassuring and sobering. Multiple agencies were now involved, with protection details assigned to key families and surveillance teams monitoring criminal network communications. But the scope of the operation meant that resources were stretched thin, and some families would be vulnerable. Emma was reading through more of Henry's strategic planning when she found information that changed their understanding of the timeline. Dad, Uncle Henry wasn't planning to wait for federal prosecutions. He was planning to expose the entire network publicly, using media coverage to create pressure for immediate action. Henry's media strategy was as carefully planned as his legal preparation. He had documentation ready for release to newspapers, television news programs, and online media outlets that specialized in Holocaust education and cultural property recovery. The evidence was organized for maximum impact, with human interest stories about individual families combined with systematic documentation of criminal networks. Your uncle understood that legal processes can take years, but media coverage creates immediate pressure for action, Dr. Klein explained. Once families know their treasures have been found, and once the public understands how criminal networks have profited from Holocaust theft, political pressure makes cover-ups impossible. Cal felt the pieces of Henry's final operation coming together with the precision of a well-designed machine. The master list provided targets. The genealogical research connected treasures with families. The legal documentation supported restitution claims. The media strategy created public pressure for action, and the federal coordination provided law enforcement support for prosecutions. Emma looked up from her laptop with the kind of determined expression that told Cal the decision had already been made. Dad, I've contacted 43 families so far, and 37 are ready to file restitution claims this week. I've also sent the master list to 3 major newspapers and 2 Holocaust education organizations. Uncle Henry's final operation is already in motion. Cal realized that they had moved beyond the point where they could control events or guarantee their safety. Henry's network was activating across multiple countries. Families were demanding action from their governments, and media coverage was beginning to expose criminal networks that had operated in secrecy for decades. The confrontation that Henry had been building toward for 30 years was about to begin, with Cal and Emma at the center of events that would determine whether justice would finally be served for families who had been waiting 70 years for someone to bring their treasures home. Agent Mitchell was coordinating final preparations when she delivered news that crystallized the stakes they all faced. "Mr. Foster, we've intercepted communications indicating that Rothstein's organization considers you and Emma to be primary threats to their operation. They're planning to eliminate you before the auction sales begin next week." Cal looked at his daughter, who was still making phone calls to families around the world, connecting people with heritage they thought was lost forever. Emma had found her calling in work that mattered more than her own safety, and Cal knew that Henry had chosen his successors well. The final phase of the mission Henry had planned would require them to risk everything to complete work that honored the memory of Holocaust victims and served the needs of their surviving families. The question was no longer whether they were strong enough or brave enough to continue it, was whether they could finish what Henry had started before the criminals could stop them. The smoking gun document arrived at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, delivered not by messenger or mail, but by Emma's relentless research into archives that most people didn't know existed. She had been working through genealogical databases and historical records for 18 straight hours, following a lead from Henry's master list that connected Rothstein's family history to the original Nazi theft operations. What she found was a digitized document from the Nuremberg trial Archivesa personnel file for SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Brenner that included detailed records of his art acquisition activities during the war. But it was the addendum to Brenner's file, written in 1947, that provided the evidence they needed to destroy Rothstein's entire operation. "Dad, wake up," Emma called, her voice carrying the kind of controlled excitement that told Cal she had discovered something extraordinary. "I found the connection between Rothstein's grandfather and the original Nazi theft operation. It's not just circumstantial, it's documented in official SS records." Cal stumbled into the hangar workshop, where Emma had multiple laptops displaying archive documents, genealogical charts, and what appeared to be translated SS personnel files. The smoking gun was a memorandum dated March 15, 1947, written by Klaus Brenner himself as part of a plea bargain with Allied prosecutors. "Listen to this," Emma said, reading from the translated document. Brenner writes, "In exchange for reduced sentences, I provide complete records of cultural property acquired during service period 1940, 1945. All items catalogued with assistance of civilian contractor Abraham Rothstein, specialist in Jewish religious artifacts. Rothstein family compensated through Swiss accounts for identification services and post-war storage arrangements." Cal felt his blood chill as the implications became clear. "Emma, are you saying that Rothstein's grandfather worked directly with the Nazis to identify and steal Jewish cultural property?" "I'm saying he was on their payroll," Emma replied, pulling up additional documents. "And look at this. After the war, Abraham Rothstein emigrated to New York and established an art-dealing business using capital from Swiss bank accounts that were funded by Nazi gold. Marcus Rothstein didn't just inherit a business, he inherited a criminal enterprise that was founded on Holocaust theft." The documentation was overwhelming in its completeness. Emma had found not just the original SS records, but financial documents, immigration records, and business registration files that traced the Rothstein family's activities from wartime collaboration through 3 generations of art dealing that had laundered hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen cultural property. Agent Mitchell arrived within an hour of Cal's emergency call, accompanied by federal prosecutors and investigators who understood immediately that Emma's discovery had provided evidence for RICO prosecutions that could destroy entire criminal networks. "Miss Foster, this documentation is extraordinary," said Janet Cooper, the federal prosecutor who had been coordinating international law enforcement efforts. "We're looking at direct evidence of generational criminal enterprise built on Nazi collaboration and Holocaust theft. This gives us legal grounds for asset forfeiture, criminal prosecution, and civil restitution that would recover hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen property." Emma was already working to decode more of Henry's master list, using the SS records to identify additional artifacts that could be traced through the Rothstein family business. "Agent Cooper, I think Uncle Henry had been building this case for years. He has documentation connecting the Rothstein operation to auction houses, private collectors, and museums across 3 continents. The SS records revealed the systematic nature of cultural theft that had continued long after the war ended. Abraham Rothstein had maintained detailed catalogues of stolen items, along with authentication, documentation, and provenance research that allowed the family business to sell Holocaust artifacts through legitimate channels for decades. "The genius of their operation," Dr. Klein explained as she examined the historical documents, "was using authentic Nazi documentation to create apparently legitimate provenance records. They could prove items were acquired during the war without revealing they were actually stolen from murder victims." Cal was reading through financial records that showed the scope of the Rothstein family's criminal enterprise. "Agent Cooper, how much money are we talking about? How much have they made from selling stolen Holocaust artifacts over 3 generations?" Cooper's expression was grim as she reviewed preliminary calculations. "Based on the documentation Miss Foster has uncovered, we're looking at a criminal enterprise that has generated more than $2 billion in revenue since 1947. This may be the largest case of sustained cultural property theft in modern history." But the discovery also revealed why Henry had been murdered. His investigation had uncovered not just the Rothstein family's criminal activities, but their connections to legitimate institutions that had unknowingly purchased stolen items and political figures who had received campaign contributions from art-dealing profits. Emma was cross-referencing the SS records with museum collections and auction house sales, finding dozens of items that had been sold to prestigious institutions with false provenance documentation. "Dad, some of the most respected museums in the world have been displaying stolen Holocaust artifacts without knowing it. When this story breaks, it's going to change how the entire art world handles provenance research." Agent Mitchell was coordinating with federal prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions, preparing for simultaneous arrests and asset seizures that would prevent the Rothstein organization from destroying evidence or moving assets offshore. "We're looking at coordinated law enforcement action across 6 countries, with arrests scheduled for Thursday morning to coincide with the New York auction house operation." The final phase of Henry's plan was more audacious than anything Cal had imagined. Rather than simply exposing individual criminals, Henry had been preparing to reveal the systematic nature of how stolen cultural property had been integrated into legitimate markets through 3 generations of carefully orchestrated fraud. Emma had been working with media contacts that Henry had cultivated over years of careful preparation. "Dad, I've sent the SS documents to reporters at the New York Times, Washington Post, and 3 international news organizations. The story will break simultaneously with the federal arrests, creating maximum pressure for recovery of stolen items." Cal realized that Emma had become the operational center of Henry's final mission, coordinating legal, law enforcement, and media efforts with the kind of strategic thinking that impressed federal investigators. His 17-year-old daughter had evolved into someone capable of directing complex operations that spanned multiple countries and involved dozens of law enforcement agencies. Dr. Klein was preparing authentication documentation that would support restitution claims for families whose treasures were about to be recovered through federal seizures. We're talking about returning cultural property to more than 300 families simultaneously. This will be the largest single act of Holocaust restitution in history. But the scope of the operation also meant extraordinary dangers for everyone involved. Agent Mitchell was frank about the risks they faced from criminal networks that had billions of dollars at stake and connections to legitimate businesses and political figures. Mr. Foster, once we execute these arrests and seizures, you and Emma will be permanent targets for anyone who profited from the networks we're destroying. There will be people who view you as threats to their financial security and family reputations. Emma looked up from her laptop with the kind of determined expression that reminded Cal powerfully of her mother's stubborn integrity. Agent Mitchell, there are 300 families who are about to get pieces of their heritage back after 70 years. There are children whose great-grandparents were murdered in the camps who will finally have something tangible to connect them to their family history. Whatever risks we face are worth that. Cal felt pride and terror in equal measure as he watched his daughter coordinate efforts that would determine whether justice would finally be served for families who had been waiting since the Holocaust ended. Emma had found her calling in work that mattered more than personal safety, and Henry had chosen his successors with extraordinary wisdom. The smoking gun document had provided the evidence needed to destroy criminal networks that had operated with impunity for 3 generations. But it had also committed Cal and Emma to seeing Henry's mission through to completion, regardless of the personal costs involved. Agent Cooper was reviewing final legal preparations when she delivered news that crystallized the stakes they all faced. Mr. Foster, Miss Foster, I need you to understand that Thursday's operation will change your lives permanently. Once we arrest these people and seize their assets, you'll be credited with providing the evidence that made it possible. You'll be heroes to families around the world, but you'll also be enemies to anyone who profited from the systems we're destroying. Cal looked at Emma, who was still making phone calls to families around the world, connecting people with heritage they thought was lost forever. His daughter had grown into someone capable of bearing responsibility that would have crushed many adults, and she had chosen to use that strength in service of justice that honored the memory of Holocaust victims. The final confrontation that Henry had been building toward for 30 years was about to begin. With evidence so overwhelming that denial would be impossible, and justice so comprehensive that it would change how the world understood the continuing legacy of Holocaust theft. Thursday would determine whether Henry's death had been the beginning of the criminals' victory or the final act of their defeat. Thursday morning arrived with the weight of history bearing down on everyone involved in Henry's final operation. At 6 a.m. Eastern Time, coordinated raids began simultaneously in New York, London, Geneva, Miami, and Los Angeles, targeting auction houses, private storage facilities, and the homes of collectors who had been identified through Emma's research into the SS documents. Cal and Emma watched the operation unfold from the Federal Command Center that had been established in Pittsburgh, surrounded by monitors showing live feeds from law enforcement agencies across 3 continents. Agent Mitchell provided running commentary as teams executed search warrants and arrests that Henry had been planning for years. New York team has secured the auction house, Mitchell reported. They're documenting more than 200 items that were scheduled for sale this week, including 37 pieces that families contacted through your research have filed restitution claims for. Emma was monitoring social media and news feeds, watching as the story broke simultaneously across multiple platforms. The SS documents she had discovered were being published by major newspapers around the world, creating the kind of media coverage that made cover-ups impossible and demanded immediate government action. "Dad, look at this response," Emma said, showing Cal messages flooding in from families around the world. People who never expected to see their family treasures again are learning that items have been recovered and will be returned to them. Generations of grief are being transformed into hope. The scale of the operation exceeded even federal expectations. By noon, law enforcement agencies had seized more than 800 individual artifacts, arrested 23 people connected to the Rothstein network, and frozen bank accounts containing more than $400 million in assets derived from stolen cultural property sales. But it was the discovery of Uncle Henry's victory medal in Marcus Rothstein's private office that provided the emotional climax Emma had been hoping for. The bronze star that Henry had earned during his wartime service had been taken from his apartment after his murder, apparently kept as a trophy by the man who had ordered his death. They killed him, and then they stole the medal he earned fighting against the same Nazis his grandfather had worked for, Emma said, her voice filled with rage and satisfaction as federal agents recovered the award. Uncle Henry's medal becomes evidence in their prosecution for his murder. Agent Cooper joined them at the command center with news that transformed the legal landscape permanently. The Swiss authorities have discovered banking records that document the Rothstein family's financial relationship with Nazi officials going back to 1943. We now have evidence of generational criminal enterprise that spans 3 countries and involves dozens of co-conspirators. Cal watched law enforcement teams documenting recovered artifacts, each item representing a family that would soon learn their heritage had been preserved and could be returned to them. The scope of Henry's vision was becoming clear. This wasn't just about individual restitution cases, but about systematic justice that honored the memory of Holocaust victims while serving the needs of their descendants. Dr. Klein was working with international teams of authentication experts, verifying the provenance and condition of recovered items to ensure that families would receive genuine artifacts with complete documentation of their history. We're looking at the largest single recovery of stolen Holocaust artifacts in history, she told Cal and Emma. Your uncle's work will result in cultural property being returned to families across 6 continents. The media coverage was overwhelming in its scope and impact. Emma's discovery of the SS documents had provided journalists with documentation that made the systematic nature of Holocaust cultural theft undeniable, while the coordinated law enforcement operation demonstrated that modern governments were finally taking recovery efforts seriously. Look at this coverage from the BBC, Emma said, showing Cal international news reports that were broadcasting the story around the world. They're calling it the largest cultural property recovery operation in modern history. Uncle Henry's work is being recognized as completing unfinished business from the Nuremberg trials. But the operation also revealed the human cost of the criminals' activities. Testimony from arrested suspects provided evidence that Henry had been murdered, specifically to prevent his evidence from being used in federal prosecutions. The man who had dedicated his life to returning stolen treasures to families had been killed by people who viewed those families' pain as acceptable collateral damage to their profits. Emma was reading through final messages Henry had prepared for exactly this scenario. Instructions for her and Cal about how to handle the aftermath of successful prosecutions and mass restitution efforts. Dad, Uncle Henry knew we would see this day. He prepared detailed guidance for working with families, handling media attention, and continuing the restitution work after the criminal networks were destroyed. Agent Mitchell provided updates as the day progressed, with arrests and asset seizures continuing across multiple jurisdictions. By evening, the Rothstein organization and its network of co-conspirators had been systematically dismantled, with evidence seized that would support prosecutions for decades of criminal activity. Mr. Foster, Miss Foster, I want you to understand what you've accomplished, Mitchell said as the operational reports concluded. Your work has resulted in the destruction of criminal networks that have operated since the end of World War II. Hundreds of families will recover cultural treasures they thought were lost forever, and the people who profited from Holocaust theft will finally face justice. Cal felt a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and profound sadness as he realized that Henry's mission had been completed successfully. His uncle's murder had been avenged, the criminals had been exposed and prosecuted, and families around the world would soon be reunited with pieces of their heritage that had been stolen during humanity's darkest period. Emma was already planning the next phase of their work, using Henry's network and the resources seized from criminal operations to expand restitution efforts to other communities affected by cultural genocide. Dad, this is just the beginning. Uncle Henry's methods can be applied to recovering cultural property stolen from indigenous communities, African heritage sites, Middle Eastern archaeological locations. Anywhere systematic theft has been used as a weapon of cultural destruction. Dr. Klein was examining the recovered artifacts with teams of international experts, beginning the authentication and documentation process that would allow items to be returned to families with complete confidence in their provenance. We're looking at months of careful work, but the result will be the most comprehensive act of cultural restitution in modern history. The victory medal that had been recovered from Rothstein's office was returned to Cal and Emma that evening, along with Henry's personal effects that had been seized as evidence. Holding the bronze star that his uncle had earned, fighting the same ideology that had motivated the criminals they had just defeated, Cal felt the continuity of a struggle that had spanned 3 generations. Emma was reading Henry's final message to them, prepared for the moment when his life's work would be completed. Cal and Emma, if you are reading this, justice has been served, and families around the world are about to recover treasures they thought were lost forever. You have completed work that Holocaust victims began when they tried to preserve their cultural heritage for future generations. The airplane in the hangar should be renamed Liberty's Promise and used to carry recovered artifacts to their rightful homes. This is not the end of the Missionit, is the beginning of a new chapter in which cultural property recovery becomes a recognized form of historical justice. Cal realized that Henry's inheritance had included not just artifacts and responsibilities, but a model for addressing cultural genocide that could be applied to injustices around the world. Emma had found her calling in work that would define her adult life, and together they had proven that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary justice when they refused to accept that some wrongs were too old or too complex to address. The coordinated law enforcement operation had demonstrated that systematic cultural theft could be prosecuted successfully when investigators had sufficient evidence and political support. The media coverage had educated the public about the continuing legacy of Holocaust theft and the importance of cultural property recovery for affected communities. Most importantly, hundreds of families would soon experience the joy of recovering heritage they thought was lost forever, completing a circle of justice that connected Holocaust victims' attempts to preserve their culture with their descendants' need to maintain connection to family history across generations. As Cal and Emma prepared to leave the Federal Command Center, Agent Mitchell delivered news that crystallized the significance of what they had accomplished. Mr. Foster, Miss Foster, I've just received word that the President will be recognizing your work in a formal ceremony next month. You've completed one of the most important justice missions in modern American history. Emma looked at her father with the kind of mature satisfaction that came from knowing she had found her life's purpose in service to something larger than personal success. Dad, Uncle Henry was right about us. We were the right people to finish what he started. Cal felt pride, gratitude, and a deep sense of completion as he realized that Henry's death had not been in vain, that justice had been served for families who had waited 70 years for someone to bring their treasures home, and that his daughter had grown into someone capable of carrying forward work that honored the memory of Holocaust victims while serving the needs of their surviving families. The final phase of Henry's mission was complete, but Emma was already planning how to continue the work on a scale that would change how the world approached cultural property recovery and historical justice. 1 year later, Cal Foster stood beside the restored Douglas C-47 that now bore the name Liberty's Promise, painted in elegant script along its silver fuselage. The airplane had been transformed from a forgotten relic into a mobile museum and cultural heritage recovery center, equipped with climate-controlled storage for artifacts and communication systems that connected families around the world with treasures they thought were lost forever. Emma had spent her freshman year at Penn State, studying aerospace engineering during the week and returning to Pennsylvania on weekends to continue the restitution work that had become her passion. Her scholarship had been supplemented by recognition awards from Holocaust education organizations and cultural property recovery groups that honored her role in exposing the largest systematic theft operation in modern history. "Dad, Mrs. Martinez is here for the ceremony." Emma called from the hangar's main entrance, where she was greeting families who had traveled from around the world to participate in the first annual Heritage Recovery Day celebration. Rebecca Martinez, the 84-year-old widow whose father-in-law's pocket watch had started their journey into Henry's world, walked slowly across the hangar floor with the aid of a walker, but with the dignity of someone who had lived to see justice served. Her grandchildren accompanied her young adults who had grown up knowing they were descended from Holocaust survivors, but had never expected to hold physical connections to their family's history. The hangar had been transformed into the Henry Foster Center for Cultural Heritage Recovery, a non-profit organization that Emma had established using proceeds from asset forfeitures and donations from families whose treasures had been recovered. The center served as headquarters for restitution efforts that had expanded to include cultural property stolen from indigenous communities, war-torn regions, and archaeological sites around the world. Dr. Klein now served as the center's chief authentication officer, leading a team of experts who worked with law enforcement agencies and cultural institutions to identify and recover stolen artifacts. Her work had been recognized by UNESCO and several major universities, establishing new standards for cultural property recovery that emphasized family needs over institutional interests. Elena Vasquez had relocated from Geneva to serve as the center's international coordinator, managing relationships with law enforcement agencies, government cultural ministries, and restitution organizations across 6 continents. The network that Henry had built over decades had evolved into a formal coalition that coordinated recovery efforts and shared resources across national boundaries. Cal had found his calling in the technical aspects of cultural property recovery, using his aviation and mechanical expertise to develop secure transportation systems for returning artifacts to families around the world. Liberty's Promise had made more than 40 flights during its first year of service, carrying recovered treasures to families in 17 countries and serving as a symbol of hope for communities affected by cultural genocide. "Ladies and gentlemen," Emma announced as the ceremony began, "we are gathered here today to celebrate the return of cultural heritage to families who thought their treasures were lost forever, and to honor the memory of Henry Foster, who dedicated his life to ensuring that systematic theft would not triumph over family memory and cultural continuity." The crowd included representatives from more than 60 families who had recovered artifacts through the center's work, along with law enforcement officials, cultural property experts, and government representatives who had supported the prosecutions that dismantled criminal networks built on Holocaust theft. Agent Mitchell, now retired from the FBI, but serving as the center's security consultant, provided updates on the legal cases that had grown out of Emma's discovery of the SS documents. "As of today, we have secured convictions against 37 individuals connected to the Rothstein network, with sentences ranging from 15 to 40 years in federal prison. Asset forfeitures have exceeded $600 million, funds that are being used to support restitution efforts and victim compensation." But the ceremony's emotional center was the stories told by families who had recovered pieces of their heritage through the center's work. David Rosenberg spoke about lighting his grandfather's menorah with his grandchildren every Friday evening, maintaining religious traditions that the Nazis had tried to destroy forever. Maria Santos, from Brazil, described receiving a painting that had hung in her grandmother's house in Vienna, before the family fled to South America in 1938. Emma had grown into someone who could address international audiences with confidence while maintaining the personal warmth that made families trust her with their most precious memories. What we've learned this year is that cultural heritage recovery isn't just about returning valuable objects to their owners. It's about completing acts of resistance that began in concentration camps and ghettos when people tried to preserve pieces of their culture for future generations. Cal watched his daughter speak about work that had transformed both their lives, seeing in her the kind of moral clarity and practical determination that Henry had recognized and cultivated. Emma had chosen a career path that would never make her wealthy, but would allow her to serve justice in ways that honored both family memory and historical truth. The highlight of the ceremony was the presentation of recovered artifacts to families who had never expected to see their heritage again. Rebecca Martinez's hands shook as she held her father-in-law's pocket watch for the first time, reading the inscription that connected her to a man she had never met, but whose memory had shaped her family's identity. Samuel Goldstein was murdered in Theresienstadt in 1944, Mrs. Martinez said, her voice carrying across the hangar filled with people who understood the weight of such losses. But his watch survived, and now his great-grandchildren will carry his memory forward. Henry Foster gave my family something we thought was impossible: a physical connection to ancestors who were taken from us before we could know them. The ceremony continued with presentations that demonstrated the global scope of the center's work. Artifacts had been returned to families in Canada, Australia, Israel, Argentina, and 12 other countries, creating a network of grateful families who supported expanded recovery efforts and shared their stories to educate others about the importance of cultural heritage preservation. Emma had established partnerships with universities that allowed students to earn academic credit for genealogical research that connected recovered artifacts with surviving family members. Her freshman dormant had become so interested in the work that she was changing her major to include cultural anthropology and international law. The most important thing we've learned, Emma told the assembled families and supporters, is that this work can't be done by just a few people. It requires communities, institutions, and governments working together to ensure that cultural genocide never succeeds permanently. Cal had been working with aerospace engineering programs at 3 universities to develop improved systems for transporting delicate artifacts across international boundaries. Liberty's Promise now served as a flying laboratory that tested new preservation technologies while carrying recovered treasures to their rightful homes. The airplane itself had become a symbol that attracted media attention and educational opportunities wherever it traveled. School groups toured the mobile museum to learn about Holocaust history and cultural property recovery, while international conferences used the plane's story to illustrate how ordinary people could achieve extraordinary justice through persistent effort and moral commitment. Martha Brennan, their elderly neighbor who had known Henry's secret for years, had become the center's volunteer coordinator for local community support. At 91, she managed a network of volunteers who helped with research, documentation, and family outreach, proving that supporting justice efforts was work that people could contribute to, regardless of age or technical expertise. "Henry would be proud of what you've accomplished," Martha told Cal and Emma as the ceremony concluded. "But he'd also tell you that the real measure of success is whether families feel whole again when they hold pieces of their history that were stolen from them." The financial pressures that had dominated Cal's life 18 months earlier had been resolved through his work with the center, which provided him with both meaningful employment and compensation that allowed Emma to attend college without debt. More importantly, both of them had found purpose that connected their daily work to historical justice and family healing. Emma's college applications had been transformed by her role in exposing international criminal networks and establishing new models for cultural property recovery. She had been accepted to graduate programs in international law and cultural anthropology at prestigious universities, with full funding from organizations that recognized her potential to expand heritage recovery efforts to other affected communities. But the center's most significant achievement was establishing cultural property recovery as a recognized form of historical justice that governments and institutions took seriously. Emma's discovery of the SS documents had provided evidence that changed how prosecutors approached cases involving systematic cultural theft, while the coordinated law enforcement operation had demonstrated that international cooperation could successfully challenge criminal networks with generational reach. Dr. Klein had used her experience with the center to establish new authentication standards that protected both families and legitimate collectors from fraud, while also making it much more difficult for criminals to launder stolen artifacts through legitimate markets. Her work had been adopted by major auction houses and museums as the new international standard for provenance research. Elena Vasquez had expanded the international network to include cultural property experts in 43 countries, creating the infrastructure needed to address systematic theft affecting indigenous communities, archaeological sites, and cultural institutions that had been looted during various conflicts. The methods Henry had developed for Holocaust restitution were being adapted to serve other communities affected by cultural genocide. As the ceremony concluded and families began to leave with their recovered treasures, Cal and Emma walked through the hangar that had been transformed from Henry's secret workshop into a center for international justice efforts. The walls now displayed photographs from restitution ceremonies around the world, along with letters from families expressing gratitude for work that had given them connections to ancestors they thought were lost forever. Emma was already planning the center's expansion into new areas of cultural property recovery, working with tribal leaders, museum directors, and government officials to address systematic theft that affected communities around the world. Her vision extended far beyond Holocaust restitution to encompass cultural heritage recovery as a fundamental human right that deserved protection and support. "Dad," Emma said as they stood beside Liberty's Promise, "I've been thinking about Uncle Henry's final message to us. He said this was the beginning of a new chapter, not the end of a mission. I think he was preparing us to spend our lives making sure that cultural genocide never succeeds permanently." Cal looked at his daughter, who had grown from a college-bound teenager into someone capable of directing international justice efforts, and felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that meaningful work will continue across generations. Henry's inheritance had included not just artifacts and responsibilities, but a calling that would define their family's contribution to historical justice. The restored airplane gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, its silver surface reflecting the Pennsylvania landscape where Henry had worked for decades to preserve treasures that families thought were lost forever. Liberty's Promise would continue carrying recovered artifacts to their rightful homes, but it would also serve as a symbol of hope for communities affected by cultural theft and a reminder that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary justice when they refused to accept that some wrongs were too old or too complex to address. Emma was reviewing plans for the center's next major operationa, coordinated effort to recover Native American artifacts that had been illegally removed from tribal lands and sold through private collectors. The methods Henry had developed for tracing Holocaust artifacts were being adapted to serve indigenous communities whose cultural heritage had been systematically stolen through centuries of colonization and institutional discrimination. "The work never really ends," Emma told her father as they locked the hangar for the evening. "Every community that has experienced cultural genocide deserves to have their heritage recovered and returned. Uncle Henry showed us that it's possible. We have to make sure it actually happens." Cal realized that Henry's greatest gift hadn't been the artifacts or the airplane, or even the successful prosecution of criminal networks. It had been the demonstration that patient, methodical work guided by moral conviction could achieve justice that seemed impossible when viewed from the perspective of individual families fighting alone against well-funded criminals. The Henry Foster Center for Cultural Heritage Recovery would continue Henry's mission, but it would also expand that mission to serve other communities and address other forms of systematic cultural theft. Emma had found her calling in work that would define her adult life, and Cal had discovered that his technical skills could serve justice in ways he had never imagined. As they drove home from the hangar, passing the rural Pennsylvania landscape where Henry had worked in secret for decades, Cal felt the deep peace that comes from knowing that important work has been completed successfully and will continue across generations. Liberty's promise would keep flying, families would keep recovering their heritage, and the network of people committed to cultural justice would keep expanding until systematic theft could no longer triumph over family memory and cultural continuity. Henry Foster's legacy lived on in every artifact returned to its rightful family, every criminal prosecuted for cultural theft, and every child who would grow up with physical connections to ancestors who had tried to preserve their heritage for future generations. The work would continue, the mission would expand, and justice would be served for communities around the world who deserve to reclaim the cultural treasures that systematic theft had tried to erase forever.